with geography, statistics, psychology, computer science, urban planning, and other disciplines. Simply put, it explains or helps us explain how and why crime events occur. So why is it important to apply crime science? Well, overall, crime science promotes ethical, effective, and equitable policing. There's some core principles of crime science. These are that prevention is more effective than apprehension. And for most effective prevention, this requires partnerships with a wide variety of stakeholders. In addition to members of the police department at all levels and all roles, we also rely on community members, businesses, and many city departments. Secondly, high-intensity enforcement alone for prevention is not sustainable or desirable. Third, community members want police to address not just crime, but quality of life issues as well. And lastly, efforts and strategies should be highly focused on conditions that create community harm. So the four core theories of crime science that I'm going to talk about tonight are the 80-20 rule, routine activity theory, crime pattern theory, and situational crime prevention. I will be discussing these concepts and using examples from Boulder data and different police department efforts. So first, the 80-20 rule. The 80-20 rule is also known as the Pareto Principle, which means that 80% of consequences stem from 20% of causes. And this is not just about crime. But in this case, as it relates to crime, crime is highly concentrated across people, offenders and victims, as well as places. And we often visualize this as a J curve that you see here. So what you see looking at the graph is that a few places or a few people or types of people have the most amount or account for the most amount of crime. And we're going to see this in some data. In criminology, this is also known as the rule is known as the law of crime concentration. A systematic review of all existing studies of crime concentration amongst places, offenders, and victims shows that about 20% of people and places usually account for at least 50% to 60% of all crime. And this graph depicts the outcomes of these 66 studies. This was written up. There's a reference to the article below on the slide. So with the goal of reducing crime and quality of life, problem solving, and improving community safety, we can examine how this 80-20 principle applies to rental properties in and around University Hill. Oh, sorry. This map depicts all rental properties in the University Hill and surrounding areas by type of property, along with a concentration of calls for service at each property. In addition to examining call counts, I've accounted for property size by standardizing by the maximum number of unrelated occupants, which comes from the rental license data for the city of Boulder. So what you see here are all of the 1,500 properties that are focused on University Hill and focused on university-related housing. And what we're going to look into are the 18,000 calls for service that occurred between January of 18 and April of 2021. And just, one more note on that is that it might be hard to see on the screen that the mean call per maximum occupant is 1.03 and the median call is 0.67. So those very large dots are well above average. Next, I will show some of the charts by property type. So these charts display calls for each fraternity or sorority house in the area. The chart on the left has places ordered according to the raw counts from highest to lowest, while the chart on the right orders the places based on the counts standardized by the maximum occupancy. While some places may switch in rank when the counts are standardized, the important thing to note is that both charts depict the J-curve that we expect to see. There have been 944 calls for service to 24 fraternity and sorority houses in a little over 3 years, and that some produce more calls than others. The top 20% of these places account for 43.4% of calls to this housing type of fraternity sorority house. You can see the same pattern if we look at the area's 98 rental condominium complexes. Both standardized and unstandardized analyses reveal these same J-curves. 70% of the 2,620 calls for service to condominium complexes originated from only 20% of these locations. These patterns hold true for other rental housing types. Oh, excuse me. Yep, we're good. Here you see the J-curves associated with call concentrations around apartments and single-family dwellings. Although not displayed, the standardized counts hold the same pattern. For both apartments and single-family dwellings, 20% of the locations account for more than 50% of calls across these housing types. The same is true for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. This type of analysis is important because it shows that 1, places are not equally problematic, and 2, even when we control for the number of occupants, some places have larger concentrations of problems than others, suggesting a need for better property management at these locations. The next crime science theory that I wanted to talk about draws attention to the importance of place management and its routine activity theory. Crime occurs when 3 elements come together: the motivated offender, which you heard the chief talk about in terms of the property and the drugs, a suitable target, and a facilitating place. Controllers can prevent the crime event. These controllers are the handlers or the guardians or the managers. For the purposes of the next portion of this presentation, we will focus specifically on the place element and the manager as the controller based on the crime triangle. I will highlight a deeper dive into crime and calls for service at one apartment complex. The San Juan community is a very vibrant and healthy community, but there are a high number of calls for service to this location. This suggests a need for police to work closely with the management team to address community concerns. When compared to other apartment complexes of comparable size, over 100 units, the San Juan del Centro apartments have significantly higher numbers of police calls for service. Whether we standardize the calls by the number of units or by the maximum occupancy, the San Juan community has a call rate 3 to 4 times higher than the apartment complexes with the next highest standardized number of calls for service. Looking at calls per year in the San Juan community over the last 5 full years and through April of 2021, we see a big jump from 2017 to 2018 and a continued trend upward through 2020. Based on the first 4 months of this year, if we extrapolate it out, it is anticipated to go back to the 2018 level. One thing to consider is that increased trust in the police can sometimes lead to more people calling that would not have called previously. Similar to calls for service, we also see a large increase in crime reports between 2017 to 2018. These then level off a bit and go slightly down, anticipated again by the first 4 months of the year if we triple those numbers. So what changed from 2017 to 2018? In order for the police to work with management to help reduce victimization in the San Juan community, Our problem analysis should focus on determining what caused the significant increase in calls and crimes between 2017 and 18. We can start to do this by attempting to answer these three questions. Did the management practices change? Or were there new offenders or fewer handlers, the controllers of the offenders from the crime triangle? And was there an increase in vulnerable victims or fewer guardians? Again, these controllers. However, to thoroughly understand the problems and develop effective solutions, crime science suggests that it is very important to be crime specific. So we need to examine different calls and crime types separately. As you can see, most of the top call types are not part one or the more serious crimes, nor is the most frequent crime type, although the amount of assaults and domestic violence crimes are concerning. The evidence base concerning what works for particular crime issues is growing. We do know that place managers can block specific crime opportunities and reduce crime in many ways. There are just a few examples relating to some of those top call and crime types. In this example, for instance, when dealing with disturbances and noise complaints, one of the most effective strategies that larger apartment complexes can employ is to have a 24/7 management presence on site. This minimizes the need for police response. The next theory that we are looking into is crime pattern theory. When we look at crime across an entire city, crime pattern theory helps to explain why and how crime hotspots develop. Crime pattern theory considers the journey to crime and overlapping victim and offender activity spaces, as illustrated here, showing the nodes, paths, and edges. There are multiple ways that offenders find suitable targets. They know the victim personally, they live or work with or near the victim, or their paths overlap. In Boulder, one of our most active activity spaces is our downtown corridor. During the pandemic, the foot traffic in downtown was significantly reduced, leaving many businesses vulnerable to break-ins. The business community suffered higher numbers of burglaries following the emergency health order that closed businesses, which reduced the downtown activity and the guardianship that was present there. To begin to address commercial burglaries, an analysis of burglaries between January 18 and March of 2021 was conducted. As you can see, again, we see a small number of street segments account for a large percentage of the burglaries. Additionally, a small number of victims were repeat victims, accounting for 52% of the burglaries in these hot segments and intersections. The police department deployed a directed patrol strategy to begin to disrupt the downtown burglary patterns. We followed the Koper curve deployment, which says that 10 to 16-minute intermittent patrols increase the visibility and positive community engagement in risky activity spaces. Officers engaged with repeat victims and helped identify and address environmental facilitators. This is only a preliminary analysis, and a comprehensive evaluation will follow. You can see from the monthly averages from 2018 and 2019 that it was normal for the downtown corridor to experience between 1 and 3 burglaries per month. This number jumped significantly in March and April of 2020 when the emergency health order was issued, and was much higher than normal in January into February of 2021 when the directed patrol started. Situational crime prevention, the last concept we'll talk about, is grounded in rational choice theory, which acknowledges that much of the crime is opportunistic. Crime is more likely to occur when crime opportunities are effortless, meaning it takes little physical effort to commit the crime. If they're less risky, low risk of being detected, highly rewarding, quick gratification or great compensation, provoked, people can be incited in the moment, or excusable have justifications for the harmful behavior. The situational crime prevention framework offers techniques to block each of these crime opportunities. Going to illustrate this with our bike theft concentration. So this map shows an analysis of bike theft locations for the most recent 2.5 years. Similar to what we've seen and talked about earlier in the presentation, we see the 80-20 principle law of concentration. In this case, the vast majority of street segments had 0 thefts, and under 5% of the street segments accounted for nearly 2/3 of the theft locations. I've listed here a couple of the top street segments as well as the top addresses. Illustrating several of the situational crime prevention techniques, the Boulder Police have worked on reducing the opportunity in 3 distinct ways by situational crime prevention. The first, increasing the effort and the risk via the distribution of theft prevention cards on the high crime segments. So again, focusing on the problem places. Reducing rewards through encouraging bicycle registration and disrupting organized operations. And lastly, by reducing provocations through a community awareness campaign, as you can see some of the examples here. There has been a 30% reduction in incidents and number of bikes stolen since these efforts have started. Next, I'm going to move into a general crime update, as the chief suggested, about Boulder crime, looking at about 5 years of data and in relation to year-to-date data. A little background initially about the National Incident-Based Reporting System. This is maintained by the FBI and designed to account for multiple offenses in one crime incident. This is a way to measure crime across the country, so jurisdictions are defining and counting crime equally. In 2021, there have been 4,150 reports involving NIBRS offenses, keeping in mind that one report can have multiple offenses. NIBRS is broken down into 3 categories: offenses against persons, such as robbery, assault, and harassment; offenses against property, such as theft, burglary, and property damage; and offenses against society, such as drugs, prostitution, and liquor violations. This first slide is showing all offense reports by month with the 5-year average and the trend we've seen so far in the first 5 months. While we had a way above average January, crime has now leveled off and even decreased below the normal average. This slide summarizes what you will see in the next few slides in more detail. Offenses against property have increased steadily since 2019, with year-to-date up by 29% over the 5-year average. Offenses against persons are down by 13% from 2020, but stable when compared to the 5-year average. And lastly, offenses against society have declined in the most recent year, including 33% from the 5-year average. This latter is likely due to decriminalization trends and the COVID-19 impacts. Here we see a breakdown of trends by category and year, showing what I just talked about on the previous slide. So you can see the breakdown and the specific numbers. Looking at the weekly trend for property offenses, we see the big spike in week 2. Most of this week 2 spike is due to a significant increase in identity theft. And we will see on the next slide some other property crimes that also had a large percentage increase this year in more details. This table shows all property crimes listed out, comparing year-to-date in 2021 through the same time for last year, as well as compared to the 5-year average. We've highlighted the 5 crime types with the largest percent increases. As I mentioned, the identity theft as well as several others. Next, we have the persons crimes by week, similar to the chart we viewed with property. You can see the weekly change somewhat mirrors the 5-year average, with a few weeks being above the normal range and a few weeks being below it. Lastly, we have the same type of chart, but with crimes against society. As I noted above, this year has generally had a lower number of these types of crimes. Now I'd like to turn it over to Katie Bridges and Mike Zadar, who will demonstrate the community crime dashboard. As you will see, the dashboard will also use the NIBRS categories and crime types that we just discussed.
Hi, thanks, Julie. My name is Katie Bridges. I am our senior data analyst. Oh, I think we might have an echo.
I think you're the echo.
Maybe we're good. Okay, I'm a senior data analyst in our IT department here at the City of Boulder. I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk about the partnership between IT and police on an open data set focusing on crime addressed by the Boulder Police Department and a dashboard that's been created with that data. This data set and dashboard are incredibly important in terms of transparency. We as city staff have an accountability to the public, and these tools give folks a way to monitor and track some of the work that we do every day. It's also important internally, as it allows other departments across the city to use this data in their work. I'd like to quickly note that open data is only one piece of the partnership between IT and police. For example, another project we're working to deliver is our enterprise data warehouse, which will allow for cross-departmental citywide analytics, and public safety data is a top priority for the data warehouse. Here, I am going to screen share our open data portal. There we go. Here we go. So this is a public website, the City of Boulder Open Data. So anyone with internet access can go to this site at open-data.bouldercolorado.gov. There are several ways to navigate the site, so folks can browse by topic or look at recently updated data. If you have a specific data set you're looking for, you can use the magnifying glass at the top right of the page. Before I hand it off to Mike Zadar for a live demo of the dashboard that we've created, I want to talk about the crime data that we used to create this dashboard and how folks can download it in Excel to view or do their own analysis on this data. So to access this data from our open data site, we can search for BPD, the Boulder Police Department, and we'll see all of the relevant options and data sets that are available come up as options here. We are going to first click on the BPD offenses data, and we're going to view that data table here. So since our open data portal is through ArcGIS, and we do have spatial data for crimes, the first thing you'll see on this page is a map of where these offenses have occurred. In this situation here, we want to download the underlying data. So in the top right corner, we're going to click on that View Table button. So here you will be able to see all of the data that we have. We have over 30,000 records since the beginning of 2018. As Julie noted, there can be multiple offenses on a single report, so this data is offense data. You can sort this data by any column by clicking on a column header. So for example, we've sorted here by report date. You would just click on that report date column header. It will sort first, ascending, and then descending. You can also filter this data before you exported it. So for example, if we wanted to look at all credit card or ATM fraud crimes that have occurred in 2021, on the left side of the screen, you'll see this funnel icon. You can click on that. Here we want to first select where the report year equals 2021. Once that's selected, the table to the right with the data will filter to show that selection. The second selection here, as Julie mentioned, is the neighbors. Oh, sorry, and that's not popping up here, but we could also filter by the neighbors definition of credit card fraud. And if we did that, there we go. We can search those neighbors descriptions and search for credit card fraud. Again, once that selection is made in this filter panel on the left side of the page, the data to the right would automatically filter to show the data that folks were interested in looking at. So now that we had this data that we wanted to export on that same menu, we do have the options, a little cloud icon with an arrow underneath it. So we can click on that cloud icon and choose to export this data. By default, all data is exported. So if you only wanted to filter what you were interested in this case, 2021 credit card fraud information, there's this option at the top to toggle filters. So you could select that. And to open this in Excel, I would recommend choosing a CSV or comma separated value format. So if this is your first time downloading data from Open Data, you'll just see a notice here that the file does not exist and it will take time to create. If you click that download button, it will automatically download to your computer. If you've downloaded data here before, you would see the option to either request a new file with current data. So this data is updated daily. So if folks wanted to continue getting updates, you could download a different file every day. We also do have an API connection to our open data site if that's of interest to folks. So those are options available in our download options. Once that downloads to your computer, folks can have access to look at this crime data. And Julie's been speaking to these trends. So if folks wanted to dive into that further, again, this data goes back to the beginning of 2018 and is publicly available on that open data site. So you could filter, you could sort, you could do your own analysis there. So this is available not only on our Boulder Police crime data, this is available on all of our data sets that are on our city website for open data. So we're really excited that this crime offenses data is out there to the public now. We're also excited we have several more in the pipeline. So you'll see here in the search option, we have stolen bikes data and also some interactive dashboards we've created here. So from here, I'm going to pass it off to Mike Zadar, who's going to give a live demo of the dashboard using the data that I just showed, and that will allow folks to further analyze the data that's available here. So you can access this dashboard yourself under this BPD Offenses app on the Open Data webpage. And from here, I will turn it over to Mike Zadar.
Thanks so much, Katie. I appreciate it. Let's see if we can share here. There we go. I think that worked. Cool. All right. So I'm super excited to be talking to you guys about the dashboards and things that we are building at the Boulder Police Department. So as Katie mentioned, this is all based on ArcGIS and the Esri platform. So as we develop more of these out, you'll start to see more and more data available to the public. But this is kind of the first, or one of the first things that Katie and I have pushed out to the public. So on our dashboard here, let me see if I can get rid of that. Yeah, on our dashboard here, we have all of that offense data that Katie was talking about from the file, which is available here. If we click on this link, you can go and see sort of live what Katie was talking about out here. So from our dashboard, you can link to that data. But here you get the NIBRS offenses for an extended period of time, and you're able to sort and filter and play around with it. So let me just run through here and show you exactly what we're looking at. So if you go out and want to play with this or do some analysis before you download the data and do further analysis, it's available to you here. So I'll start with this little hamburger menu at the top. It's got a couple of links in here, so you can go to the Boulder Police homepage. You can file a report online through this other link, and then you can jump to that open data from here as well. The map in the center has a few icons here at the top. Our first one is our base map. So if you don't like this sort of nighttime style base map, you can come in here and select a bunch of base maps that are available through the city's GIS, as well as some other base maps here. So if you would like a navigation base map or something like that, that's available to you out here. For this, I'll switch back to the darker base map. You also have this little button here that will show you what's on the map. So you can see the little red dots are a BPD offense. And then the colored areas here on the map are the police beats. You also get this little what do you call that? Magnifying glass icon there. If you click on that, you can search for a location. So if we look for the Boulder Police Department, you can click on that and it'll zoom us right into the public safety building there. And so if you have an area of the city that you're interested in or whatnot, you can search for it there and it'll take you right to that location. So on the map, you've also got the little red dots here. If we click on one of those dots, we're able to see some information about that offense report. So we get, the report number, when it was reported, the year, the NIBRS offense code, the description. We also get an obscured address for where this occurred. So one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these data is that we do obscure the addresses to the block level, and we also randomly offset the location of the point. So it is in a general area of where that offense occurred, but it's not going to be exactly like on the dot where that offense occurred. So that is that. All right. So let's explore a little bit more here. So off here to the right, we have these different totals here of what these offenses are. And as we sort and filter, so if we select like year to date, our data will update. And there's a whole lot of points there. I don't know if that's super useful, but you are able to see the counts here, which I do think is useful, where you can see that, offenses against people, we've had 454 year to date here. And if we wanted it to sort, and filter even more, we can do that as well. So if let's say we're just interested in property crime, we can click on property crime. And let's say we're interested in burglary, we can click on burglary. And there we go. We have 278 burglaries. We can see some of that crime concentration that Julie was talking about in certain areas of the city. And we also get this chart here that will update, so you can kind of see some of the trends here. And there's that peak that Julie was talking about and the reduction that we have seen. You also get this charts tab. So at the bottom, you can click on these tabs, and there's various items inside these tabs. So if we unselect burglary, we can look at all of the different crime types here, and you get a variety of ways of examining the data and looking through some of these things. So by hour of day, day of week, and the top offenses, and all of these are interactive as well. So if you click on Friday, for example, it'll filter that hour of day for just Friday. So if you're only interested in crimes on a weekend or something like that, this gives you the ability to sort and filter and look at that data in that way. Same thing with the map and our selectors over here. If we're interested in burglaries that happened on, let's say Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we can look at that, and let's look at those for the last 30 days. And so we can see that our map view changes, and you can really dig in and explore some of these different things. The next tab we have here are some crime prevention tips. So just some safety tips in general around crime issues, as well as tips about being prepared for emergency situations. Our last tab on the bottom here is the NIBRS offense descriptions and codes here. So if you have questions about what a specific code means or something like that, we have links here to tell you about what that is. If you want more information about NIBRS, we also have a link up here at the top where you click on this, and that'll take you to the FBI's webpage on NIBRS, where there is a ton of information. If you're a data geek like me, this is fantastic. There's data from all over the country. The FBI has an API that you can access and pull in a bunch of data and look at data from NIBRS reporting agencies across the country. Go back here. All right. So let me clear some of these filters out here, and we can look at that. Okay, cool. All right, so that is our crime dashboard. Like I said, we're going to be building several more of these. I can tease another one here. We do have a bike theft dashboard out here, which is pretty interesting. It breaks down the number of stolen bikes, the number of crime reports that we have, and also the cost for those bikes. So this is the last 28 days here in the city of Boulder. And you can also look at like 90 days, and those figures will all update. So you can see what the cost of some of these crime categories is. And as the chief said, more of these types of dashboards are going to be coming along as we produce them. So that is what I have on the dashboards. Let me see if I can stop sharing here. There we go. All right. Katie, what is next on our list there?
I think that is it. If there are any questions or anything, we can certainly answer those.
Yeah, thanks, Mike and Katie and Julie. We'll be glad to answer any questions. I know that was a lot of information to throw at you in a very short amount of time, but I did want to cover as much ground as possible. So I'll be happy to answer any questions about any portion of the presentation.
Thank you all for that very fascinating presentation. Council, does anybody have any questions? I don't see any hands going up. There's one. Rachel and then Bob.
I think that you answered this question, and thank you all for the great presentation. I'm looking forward to digging into the data set myself. So when you look at the dots or any of the, I think there was a list too with the crimes listed, you can't identify any particular victim by their house, right? Like you have kind of anonymized it in that way. Just wanted to confirm.
Yeah, that's correct. We obscure the address to just the block address. And like I said, we also randomly offset that point. So if the point were to fall on an individual house, there's a random offset. So it's going to be in the, again, like I said, it'll be in the general area within, maybe a 5 house sort of area, but it will certainly not be identifiable as an individual address.
Okay, perfect. And is that true? Like there was some question about a previous data set that people could sort of identify complainants. I think Chief Harold, you probably know what I'm talking about. It was I think Hill related, if you had called in on a certain address, you could see sort of the address of the complainant, and that was possibly problematic. So I wanted to make sure that that was also not identifiable.
Yeah, Rachel, that will not be identified as part of the dashboard. If a person calls in and makes a complaint and that becomes public record, somebody could request that data point through a public records request if it went through 911 or a report was made with the complaint.
Okay. So this was more somewhere on a website. You could pinpoint sort of where complaints were made from. So that wouldn't be true.
I can answer that. It was on our Inquire Boulder site that has been updated. That is anonymized in the same way. So no one could find the address from our Inquire Boulder dashboard. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And then there was a slide like with you lock your bike recommendation. And have we given pretty good recommendations for what kind of locks people should buy? I saw there was a 20% off thing. And if that's a big thing that we're pushing, are we making it really easy for people to know what is the best lock to prevent a theft and getting the card in people's hands? If bike locks are pretty expensive for the good ones.
They're very expensive. They're like $50 for the really good ones. We are trying to make it as available to everyone as possible. The bike shops in Boulder have been very supportive of giving the discounts, but for preventing bike theft, the U-lock, without a doubt, I've tested it myself. It is the only way to prevent bike theft. The chain link or all the other locks can be defeated within 5 seconds with a good pair of pliers. So U-locks, any type of U-lock is what is needed.
Awesome. And then there was a picture that showed lock in both tires. So that must be a secondary kind of lock that people should be getting to. Sorry to dig in, but that seems like a big crime that's happening. So I want to make sure people have the information.
It is, and I'll tell you, our crime prevention officer has done an outstanding job working with all the bike shops, and they are boots on the ground getting this information out, especially on those hot street segments. But if the community is listening, please put your bikes in a U-lock. It works. We've tried to defeat the U-locks ourselves. We can't do it, and it is the only way to prevent bike theft.
That's great. And then, and thank you for getting that information out. And then my last question, you mentioned that property crimes are still up, and it looked like they spiked a lot in January, and I couldn't tell from the quick presentation, is that still trending up each month as we're going forward, or is there more information on specifically property crimes? Because that's the one that sounds like it's not coming back down. So I don't think it's staying at the January peaks, but is it still significantly up?
Yeah, we're trending, we're about 29% up. And I expect in our prediction models, property crime is going to continue to be problematic throughout the fall. And there are multiple reasons for that. We're still struggling with jail restrictions. Even though I've had great conversations with Sheriff Pelley, and we're working on a strategy that I think that he's going to have a public statement on July 1st about his strategy. But I think we're going to continue to see property crime, and that's why this is so important for the community to understand the crime trends, patterns in their particular areas, so we can start to target, harden, locks, lights, the basics, to prevent some of this property crime. Right now, the state of Colorado is seeing 60% increases in motor vehicle theft. We are no different in Boulder, and these motor vehicle thefts are being stolen from major roadways, and it is all based on economics right now. And so not only Boulder, but the rest of the state is struggling mightily in these areas.
And is there anything else in terms of hardening, like with the ULOCs, that we want to make sure to highlight right now?
Yeah, and that's one of our education public awareness campaigns is most certainly instructing the community on these crime patterns. What we're seeing, there's most certainly crime concentration in certain areas, but burglaries are all about lighting, locks, watching out for your neighbors. And Mike's dashboard has all of these crime prevention techniques on the dashboard. But it really is, most of these property crimes are crimes of opportunity and can be prevented if people lock their car doors, don't put stuff in your vehicles. Lighting becomes so important, and public awareness of what's going on around them. The catalytic converter issue is very hard to prevent. And we have partnered with the state of Colorado, the Public Safety Department. So they're providing education and training as well as us. But these catalytic converters can be sold, they can be removed off a car within, I've seen people do it within 15 seconds, and they can be sold for $100 to $300 quick. And they usually hit 15 to 20 cars in a series of crimes within minutes. And so the best advice is really, you can either paint or etch a serial number in your catalytic converter, so at least they can't be sold quickly to area recycling companies around the region.
Thank you for that. And for those of us who may not know what a catalytic converter looks like, is that up on the website? Like if you want to etch or spray paint your own, here's the thing to look for underneath your car.
It's right next to your muffler, and it's all about the metal. It's all about palladium, and it is the economic factors of really international are driving this crime. And this trends, like, copper prices, when they go up, you see copper theft. So these are economic factors, and we try to block as many of these opportunities as possible.
All right, thanks so much.
Bob.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Chief. Thanks, team. That was a great presentation. Just a quick question. I'm sorry if I missed this. Can you give some examples of crimes against society?
Yeah, that's a great question. Crimes against society are liquor, usually a lot of liquor law violations, animal cruelty, prostitution, which now, I think the best practice way to say that is human trafficking issues, drugs. All of the drug would fall into that category as well. Those are your major crimes against society.
Great. Thanks, Chief. That's all I had.
Thank you, Bob. Sam?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks, Chief, and all for the presentation. Super helpful. Great to see the open data available this quickly to everyone. I look at the 5 property crimes that were highlighted. So it was slide 35. It was the red boxes around the largest increase in crimes. And we've already heard about one, which is theft of motor vehicle parts or accessories, but it also seems like motor vehicle theft itself is up quite a bit. And so those 2 are ones that we've heard a lot about, along with bike thefts. So do you have any, not only suggestions, but ideas about what the police department might do to bring those rates back down to where they've been over the last 5 years?
The motor vehicle theft is challenging because people are leaving their extra and spare keys. What we find when we look at the reports is that they're leaving their spare keys or their valet keys in the car. So this is really about public awareness, not to do that because people are looking for those valet keys. Leaving your cars open is also very problematic. And so when you read these reports, through these reports, you find that people are either leaving their keys in the car, their cars open, and they're easy targets. And the areas that we want to get out, and we have a public education campaign, these cars that are being stolen are the cars that are parked near the major exits and entryways into Boulder and out of Boulder. So this really is about educating the public on please do not leave your keys in the car. Please do not leave property in the car, put it in the trunk. Don't leave your valet keys, and please don't leave your keys in your ignition or somewhere in the car because people are going through these cars and finding these keys and they are being dumped in different parts of the region. And so it really comes down to a public awareness campaign on both motor vehicle theft and then also theft from vehicles, which is also problematic as well, Mayor.
Thanks for that. It does seem that whatever habits people might have had with leaving their valet and spare keys in their car is something that probably hasn't changed a lot, but people are taking advantage of it, it seems like, more frequently. You did mention that there are more vehicles being stolen near entrances and exits to the city. I think that's revealing in and of itself. So I just wanted to highlight that because that seems like it's a pretty big increase and a pretty big ticket item for a lot of people. So thanks for that, and thanks for the great report.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Sam. Mark?
Thank you, Mary. Chief, thank you for that presentation. That was a lot of data, and it was really, really quite useful. Going back to the slide that shows the calls for service on the Hill, one of the, at least perceptions, is that when the call for service is made, by the time it is responded to, it becomes impossible to actually identify who is responsible for whatever the activity it was that was causing the call in the first place. Are there any strategies that could be used to either shorten the response time or somehow make a better correlation between the call for service and identifying the action and the people involved that are committing that activity?
That is a great question. I don't think it's the response time issue. I know the community has a perception of that. What is challenging is to prove understand what offense occurred that they're calling about, especially as this relates to noise. The police have good response times to the Hill, but it's proving that the loud noise and what occurs is the community members, when they see the police car pull up, they turn the music off, they shut the lights down, and they don't answer the door. This makes it very complicated for the police to investigate these very low level ordinances. And so I think what the data clearly demonstrates is that we have severe place management issues on the Hill. And I think it's clustering around certain landlords, management teams. And I think that we really need to understand the amount of calls for service being generated from a very few places on the Hill. And I'm sure this would remain consistent as we look at the rest of the city in the same way we have started to look at the Hill. But in my opinion, we're not going to be able to police our way out of these noise complaints and disorder complaints. It is just overwhelming when you look at the data, how many calls for service we have across the Hill area. It's overwhelming. And I think the data clearly demonstrates the 80-20 principle there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from council? All right, if not, I have one. Thank you for that very fascinating presentation and all the way around. Really appreciate it. My question has to do with the call data and specifically on the Hill and at the San Juan community. where you mentioned during the presentation that all of this suggests that there's a better, that there's a need for better property management. So what are the strategies to attain better property management, and how can we implement them in Boulder?
Great question, Mary. And I think this really comes down to landlord education training that is sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Administration. And I think a lot of landlords don't know how complicated it is to actually run a property and not have high calls for service or high crime. So I think that there's an educational component, which we most certainly could do in Boulder, and each city department could take a lead on the training. And then secondly, I think that the city has put together a team under Nuria's direction to really start exploring model policies across the country on chronic nuisance abatement. And then thirdly, we really have to get a clear understanding and of our data across the city and standardize it for different apartments and different types of properties across the city. But I would bet my bottom dollar that the principles will remain consistent as we start to look at other parts of the city as well.
Thank you, Maris. And I have, so just to follow up, if like you said, we're not gonna police our way out of this problem, what could we do on a small scale to begin with, say a pilot program, that would get us going on some of these strategies that you mentioned?
Well, Nuria's already put together a really good team in the city to start refining our data, which is step number one. We're also exploring landlord education training with the university. In short term, the university, myself and the planning director are going to pilot some code enforcement and intelligence work up on the Hill. And then as we're looking at the San Juan property, which is really fascinating to me, because our team here in the police department is indicating, you know, a few years ago, the community members of San Juan did not have a lot of trust in the police department. And now that they see the police on a daily basis, that trust is building. And so maybe that's why we're seeing high calls for service. So all of this is exciting to me because at least we have actionable data to start tearing apart these problems and working together as a team. But I think the team will continue to work on these, you know, these high calls for service locations. And I think that we really have to start educating these landlords. And then at the end of the day, if we need to have a stronger chronic nuisance abatement ordinance, I think that's in order. When you look at the amount of calls for service to some of these locations, it must be traumatizing for the community to see the police in these communities so much. And I don't think that's the direction that we want policing to go. So I think this, again, is a great example of where the city could use holistic governance and work together as a team to start solving these community problems that really is causing a great amount of community harm.
Thank you, Maris. What I'm hearing then is that y'all are on it. And that's great.
I think we are, and I think it's just because we're really getting an understanding of our data, and it's going to get better, and we're going to be able to really pinpoint and isolate the 80-20 principle across the city. And I think that's very powerful. And so I'm excited for the work because I think that the biggest part of police reform that people miss is trying to extract police from constantly going back and forth to some of these problem areas, but use a whole city holistic approach. And I'll tell you that other city departments have levers that are much more impactful on some of these crime and disorder issues than the police. And so I'm excited. I think we have a great team under Nuria's leadership, and I think we're going to do big things.
Thank you. And thank you for all the work you all are doing. Any other questions from council? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item.
Thanks, Mary. I know this item has been bumped a couple times, and I'm excited that AMP's implementation and action plan is before you today. So I'll invite Chris Hagelin in Public Works and Chris Jones in Community Vitality to present.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen real quick and hand it over to Chris Hagelin.
All right. We'll wait till that comes up. Make sure it comes up. Yes. So good evening, Mayor, City Council. My name is Chris Hagelin. I am the acting manager of the Transportation Planning Division of Transportation Mobility. And as you know, I am joined by Chris Jones, Deputy Director of Community Vitality. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. This is the agenda for this evening's study session on our current AMPS efforts. Following a refresher of the project background, I will share the process that we have taken for the development and refinement of these strategic options, which we'll present to you tonight. And then Chris Jones will share with you the specifics on our neighborhood parking management, parking pricing strategies, and then also our parking fine strategies. And then it will return to me and I will share some of the feedback that we have received from boards and councils and the next steps that we are prepared to take, and then the questions we have for you tonight. As you know, the work that we've done in AMPS is guided by 3 major documents: the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, our Transportation Master Plan, and the Access Management and Parking Strategy documents known as AMPS. These have all shaped our work. And as you may recall, the AMPS guiding principles were adopted by Council in 2017. And they include that in Boulder, our residents, employees, and visitors use a variety of transportation options, and we need to plan and provide access for all of those. We need to employ new innovative tools and strategies to improve multimodal access and manage demand in different parts of our city. We need to be inclusive and recognize the diversity within our community and strive to advance social and racial equity. We need policies and programs that not only provide transportation access benefits, but also meet our economic vitality and climate goals. And lastly, in our fast changing and very unpredictable world, as we have certainly felt in the last couple of years, we need to plan for the present, but also adapt to the future and its social, environmental, technological, and economic changes. Next slide, please.
It's stalling for a moment, sorry.
All right, there we go. Thank you, Chris. This chart, which I believe you've seen before, provides some examples of the variety of projects underway under the AMPS umbrella. As you know, CAMP is our annual parking management and free shuttle service to Chautauqua, which is currently operating right now. For our city government offices and the main civic library, we implemented a new parking management strategy and also a parking cash out program for our city employees. Staff continues to work on a possible TDM ordinance for new developments to mitigate the impacts of new development on our transportation system. And that project is directly linked to our parking code changes project, which unfortunately has been delayed due to staff reductions in the planning and development services. However, we hope to get that back on track in the near future. This fall, we're also kicking off a curbside management program. We received a grant from Dr. Cog, and we'll be looking at developing a set of curbside management policies and an implementation guideline so we can begin looking at how we employ that in our city. The final 2 projects are really what we're here today to discuss with you: our neighborhood parking management, our parking pricing, and our parking fine strategy. This graphic illustrates our project timeline. Currently, we are designing the implementation and action plan, which outlines our preferred strategies, our next steps, and our costs. Following months of community outreach, alternative analysis, and input from our boards and commissions, we are bringing preliminary recommended strategies for this discussion tonight, the study session. And I apologize if you hear my dog barking outside. Overall, the project objectives are to rework both our neighborhood parking management and parking pricing approach, and we want this to be more aligned with our broader city goals around access, mobility, and climate. To meet these project objectives, we've analyzed our existing conditions, we've conducted extensive community engagement, and we've also looked at best practices in other communities. We have also taken time to incorporate the teachings of Donald Shoup into our strategies as well. In terms of community engagement, we have shared information on our project website, we've collected responses to polls and surveys, and conducted focus groups within our current NPP neighborhoods. We've tracked these demographics closely, and we're pleased with our results in reaching people of color, both younger and older residents, and also renters. We've met with community organizations, boards and commissions, and we also formed a community working group which we dubbed the Access Allies. This was made up of representatives from boards and commissions and also property owners and other stakeholders such as the Downtown Boulder Partnership. We also had an Access Allies Light group. This was a group that was made up solely of our boards and commissioner representatives, so we can really dive deeper into policies and strategies. We've also worked with our community connectors, who are our paid liaisons, to help us reach some of our harder to reach groups in our community. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris Jones to go over the strategies.
Thank you, Chris Hagelin. Good evening, Council. On the screen, you see in front of you the goals that we vetted with you earlier this year for neighborhood parking management. I'm not going to read through these one by one, but these are the goals that we looked to in the development of the strategies that we considered and wanted to evaluate through this process. The three strategies that we have considered for neighborhood parking management are the first, minor program adjustments. This would be a status quo approach to our existing MPP creation, expansion, and management, but would have included some modifications to mitigate some of the persistent program challenges that we've heard from residents who participate in MPP or are adjacent to neighborhoods that are in MPPs with some parking challenges associated with that. Another strategy we looked at was data-based decision-making. This would have been a staff-driven approach to neighborhood parking management, where we identify and implement changes in neighborhood parking management, but really largely proactively led by staff delivering management strategies to neighborhoods. The third strategy we looked at was priority-based neighborhood access management. This is similar to the data-based decision-making approach, where we would identify available management tools, prioritize based on key performance indicators that we would measure and evaluate. But implementation of these tools would still require a neighborhood petition process. When we measured those three strategies against the goals that we vetted with you earlier this year, priority-based neighborhood access management was identified as the most aligned with those goals in all areas, achieving the same or better results other than feasibility. So we acknowledge that with that approach, it would require additional staff time and resources to implement. If we were to pursue this strategy, what that might look like is, first, in order to achieve cost recovery, we acknowledge we need to increase the permit costs for residents and commuters in the years ahead in order to, what we project, get to cost recovery by 2024. We're proposing a $13 increase in the annual permit for residents, a $20 increase in commuters next year, with, again, incremental adjustments till 2024 when we can achieve cost recovery. Beyond that, we can certainly continue a conversation to identify other ways that we might use surplus if we want to continue cost increases for residents and commuters that could translate into additional benefits to add value to the products we're providing in neighborhoods. Concurrent with this work over the next couple of years, the city would review our parking supply utilization, adjacent land uses, and multimodal access scores within residential areas throughout the city and existing MPPs to determine which zones and residential areas would be eligible for various management tools, and depending on how they meet these set metrics. Existing NPP zones could be deemed no longer eligible for neighborhood parking management based on those key performance indicators, and we would possibly seek to phase those NPPs out. Again, though, a petition process would need to be received from neighborhoods who want to pursue new tools in their communities, and the petitions would be evaluated and prioritized based on those key performance indicators. And this is really similar to the neighborhood speed management program that Transportation and Mobility currently pursues on an annual process today. For parking, pricing, and fines, we again identified a number of goals we vetted with you earlier this year. Again, not going to read through them, but these are the goals that we look to identify various strategies for both parking pricing in our current managed districts and our fines strategy. So the three strategies we looked at for parking pricing were first, static price adjustments. This would be periodic price increases based on our budget needs and peer assessments, similar to how we've pursued price increases in the past. Another strategy we looked at was place-based pricing. So looking at the aggregate parking utilization for specific geographic areas and pricing on-street and off-street facilities appropriately based on the geographic utilization. A third strategy we looked at is performance-based pricing, and this would be more fine-tuned pricing adjustments based on occupancy data along specific corridors throughout the city. When we evaluated those three strategies against our goals, performance-based pricing was identified as the most aligned with those goals in performing the same or better in all areas except for achieving transparency and predictability, where if we are having different pricing on different corridors, there will be some challenges in making sure that the public is aware of where those higher prices might be. And again, feasibility of this more refined approach to parking management will require more staff time and effort to implement. If we pursue the performance-based pricing, what that might look like is we want to make sure that our on-street parking is priced higher than off-street parking, so that folks who are aware of those pricing structures can just go straight to an off-street facility instead of circling trying to find cheaper parking on-street. Corridors would then be evaluated and set at high, medium, and low parking rates depending on their typical peak occupancy. And then some high demand corridors where we're even at the high rate where the parking pricing is not able to ensure that there is at least about 15% capacity on those corridors. We'd want to identify some priority spaces for short-term pickup and drop off for business, freight, loading, unloading, Uber, Lyft, things like that. Corridor rates would be updated regularly based on our typical peak demand. And fortunately, the new meters that we've just installed throughout the downtown and University Hill are able to be programmed easily with these variable rate structures. On the right here, you see an example of a possible approach we could use for branding to make this more transparent and predictable for customers. The suggestion here is maybe using CU's school colors to identify the different rates from high, standard to a base rate. For our fine strategy, again, we have three approaches that we've considered. The first would be status quo, not making any change to our fine strategy. The second would be graduated fines and mobility safety fines for repeat offenders, and higher fines for violations that impede other users' travel choices, such as parking in a bike lane or blocking access to a transit stop or an ADA ramp. The third strategy includes that approach, but also adds having different fines for different parts of the city based on parking utilization rates. When we measured those strategies against our goals, the second strategy, graduated fines and mobility safety fines, has been identified as the most aligned in all areas except for recognizing the value of the right-of-way, where if we were using parking utilization to determine fines, it would be harder to implement on a staff level, but it would be more in alignment with utilization of right-of-way. If we were to pursue the graduated fines and mobility safety fines, we would want to first increase our base fine rate for a standard parking violation from what's currently $15 to $30. From there, second and third violations would be set with a graduated premium, capped out on the third violation, which we're currently proposing at $60. Mobility safety violations would be set automatically at that premium rate proposed at $60. And from that, I'll hand it back over to Chris, and he can let you know what we've heard from boards and commissions.
Thank you, Chris. During our touches with boards and commissions, we received a wide variety of feedback, and we incorporated that into the strategies that Chris has shared with you. For neighborhood parking management, we shifted to a more equitable split between residential and commuter pricing and accelerated cost recovery to 2024. We also tied key performance indicators to trip generation for new developments to make neighborhood parking management a proactive tool during our planning process. For parking pricing, we increased the difference between off-street and on-street parking prices and included the 15-minute free on-street parking. We have committed to regularly tracking vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas reduction impacts to understand the impact of these parking management changes. We are also committed to expanding TDM and mobility initiative programs following the achievement of cost recovery. Parking pricing will be responsive to changes in parking demand distribution and intensify in transitional districts like Boulder Junction as they evolve and densify. And we've also changed some of the terminology we've used in our parking fines. In regard to overall board and commission sentiments on these strategies, the Downtown Management Commission is generally supportive and interested in increasing off-street parking use, and also very interested in the up and coming curbside management work getting started this fall. The University Hill Commission supports the strategies developed through this process. BJAD, Boulder Junction Access Districts, is also supportive of the strategies and the approach, but is also open to some higher off-street parking prices within their district. Planning Board views this the approach that staff is taking as conservative and incremental, and that a more aggressive approach could be taken, but they understand the need to balance equity, economic vitality, and environmental goals. TAB desires that council direct staff to take a more aggressive approach to parking prices and to really use it as a tool to address greenhouse gas reduction needs and to decrease vehicle use. TAB also believes that residents can and should pay more for their neighborhood parking permits, and that the price for residential permits should rise faster to achieve cost recovery sooner. We do have Ryan Chouchard from TAB at this meeting, and he is available to elaborate on TAB's feedback if so desired. Considering council's earlier feedback and recent discussions at TAB, we believe it's important to explain how staff has incorporated Donald Shoup's teaching into these strategies. Essentially, there's 6 main principles in Donald Shoup's approach to parking management, and we have taken the time to incorporate these. The first is charging the right prices for on-street parking. The right prices are really those the lowest prices that will achieve a 15% parking availability. So there is never a parking shortage. Prices will balance demand and supply on these on-street spaces. Staff is going to collect data and over time adjust pricing to balance supply and demand, just as this principle indicates. The second is to charge demand-based pricing for off-street parking to optimize occupancy. Staff are proposing that the city change pricing to make on-street parking more expensive to optimize this off-street parking use, and which I think is currently underutilized. The third principle is to spend parking revenue to improve public services. So staff is proposing this idea, and really the city has been doing this for decades through property taxes and parking revenue in our districts. KJIT has supplied eco passes to our downtown employees. In Boulder Junction's TDM Access District, we provide not only eco passes, but also bike share and car share memberships, and soon micromobility memberships. The city periodically also issues bonds against anticipated parking revenue for projects within these districts to improve safety, aesthetics, and walkability. The fourth is to remove off-street parking requirements. Planning and Development Services will be working to identify changes in these parking code. And I would say that our preliminary recommendations before we got to the pause was to transition away from parking minimums to parking maximums. The fifth being promoting parking cash out programs. The city initiated a program for its own employees in the civic area to great success. Employers throughout Boulder are already doing this voluntarily, and Boulder Transportation Connections, which is our local transportation management organization, is focused on increasing parking cash out programs, and before COVID had acquired a congestion mitigation air quality grant, or CMAQ grant, to promote parking cash out. So we're going to continue to work on that as we adjust to this post-COVID environment. The final shoe principle is to use parking fines that increase with each successive offense. And as you've just heard, this is definitely part of our proposal tonight. So to go over just kind of our next steps, if we were to implement these strategies for the neighborhood parking management, we would adjust the resident and commuter annual permits by $10 and $20 respectively to achieve cost recovery by 2024 with additional increases. We would update the ordinance and regulations for our new NPP process. We'd maintain the pause on any new NPP zones requests throughout this next year, and then we can start revisiting those. We will conduct extensive data collection in those residential zones to look at the impact of these changes. We will establish eligibility and priority for the possible creation of new neighborhood management zones, and also look at possibly phasing some out that no longer meet our KPIs. We would also develop, of course, the outreach materials to communicate these changes to the public. In terms of parking pricing, we would update the ordinance and regulations with help of our city attorney's office. We'd increase the base on-street rate throughout the city by 25 cents, but maintain the current rate in our garages. We will eliminate the 4-hour graduated fee, but implement a flat max pricing after 6 hours, and also extend the evening flat rate to the weekends. And of course, we would need to develop outreach materials to communicate this to the public. And then we'll really begin that whole process of collecting data to implement this performance-based pricing based on occupancy, so that we can dial into that right price to achieve that 15% occupancy. And finally, for the parking fine strategy, if we move forward with these strategies, we will need to update the ordinance and publish the fine schedule, and then of course communicate those changes to the public. Overall, for this entire effort, additional next steps include making any changes to our action plan and the strategies based on your feedback tonight. We will continue our community engagement based on those refined strategies, and then we plan on returning to council with our finalized 2022 work plan on these AMPS efforts in the fourth quarter of this year. That leaves us with the questions that we have for council. And just to let you know, the third question, we thought after the feedback that we had received, that we wanted to hone in the third question a bit more. So we have revised that third question just to help guide the discussion tonight. So with that, we look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris and Chris, for the presentation and information. Looks like we have a bunch of hands up, and I didn't see, I believe Aaron was first, and then followed by Bob, and then Sam.
And real quick, Mary, I'm glad to stop sharing my screen because I know people like to see faces, but I just want to make sure folks have an opportunity to review the questions.
And council members, the questions are on packet page 24, if you want to go to them on your packet.
Great, thanks, Mary. And yeah, thanks so much, Chris and Chris, for the presentation and all your work on this. It's wonderful to see this coming forward. I feel like I started working on this when I was just a wee planning board lad many years ago. So it's great to see some steps happening here. I have a few questions, but first I just wanted to see if our TAB representative, Ryan Schuchard, wanted to offer a few comments on TAB's deliberations and their recommendations. So would it be possible to get Ryan on board to say a few words?
Hi, Aaron. I think I'm here. Is that my cue?
That is your cue. Hi, Ryan.
Okay, great. Well, good evening, council members. So I'm Ryan Schuchard, and I represent TAB. I'm not our chair, but Tila has given me the role tonight to represent us because I've been somewhat engaged on the topic. If I could, I'll just say a few words. And first, I just do want to acknowledge Chris and Erica and Natalie, partly for all of their great work as I've gotten to know them, but also because I'm pretty new to TAB and they've been at this for years, as you mentioned. And also, I should just clarify, we as TAB, we have not voted on a resolution. So I'm not here to represent a specific position, but it's more that we've had quite a bit of dialogue over the last couple of months. So I'll just try to represent what I think we've talked about. And I'll just say that Chris is exactly right, that TAB would like to move more aggressively. And I'll just try to summarize it with one big idea. And it's that if there's one thing that's worth council's attention today on this subject, it's that if you take the various measures individually with parking, it rapidly becomes very technical, and it's kind of hard to make sense of unless you're really inclined to that kind of technical analysis and you have the time to spend with the data. But if you zoom out, what you start to see are some things that are more in the domain of values and priorities that council has expressed a lot of opinion about, and things that if you really wanted to put parking to work for, then staff would require your direction, support, and cover. So what am I talking about? Well, parking is a few things. Of course, it is a place to put cars. But beyond that, it's at least three more things. First, it's one of the city's most powerful assets for climate action. In the council session, study session, which I attended a couple of weeks ago, Boulder's climate office staff were very direct in saying that progress on climate to date has been shallow, and the city needs to act on climate with a lot greater urgency. I thought I saw council members mostly agreeing with that. And to that end, parking policy is truly one of the city's big opportunities for climate. We see that through all kinds of different studies around transportation demand management, and including from the work of Donald Shoup, who's been mentioned. And this is because parking economics is a major determinant, maybe one of the key determinants of local driving, which is, of course, one of the biggest chunks of GHG. Parking policy is also one of the city's rare big levers in which it itself directly controls and can literally overnight change and fine tune. And if you think of the corollary, it's that parking is, just in a general policy sense, it is a significant source of potential conflict with climate and GHG reduction, and vehicle miles traveled reduction, Vision Zero. And so to really, if you wanted to put parking really to work for climate, you would be looking at what are the ways that we can really pull the lever on parking pricing and some of the related subjects. So that's the first thing. Second thing, what is parking? Parking is also a large amount of publicly owned real estate. On-street parking is a valuable public good, and hence it's something that the general population of residents pay for directly and indirectly, and which a subset of residents benefit from. And it is not predestined that the public space we currently use to provide public subsidized car storage needs to be used that way. So if you just think about the value of the real estate of the parking, the numbers will start to add up very quickly. And the question one might ask is, if you were starting from scratch, would you use $50 a square foot real estate and just give that away for free, or for mostly for free? And the third and the final thing that parking is, at least for tonight, is it's a service with the market price. And so that means that cheap prices for on-street parking storage means that cars will appear to take up the space. If you increase the prices, it means that cars will begin to disappear as people choose private locations to park, to get rid of an extra vehicle, and or take the bike or bus, and more parking spaces will free up. If you remove subsidized parking altogether, people are still free to park their cars at a market rate. And you can imagine local businesses and even private residents who have garage, driveway, and other space, they'll compete to supply it. And we've seen this everywhere. So just to tie it up, if you take a hard look at climate or equity, and you say we really care about making serious changes, you should expect it to look a lot like moving away from the status quo, not just incrementally, but really saying how we are going to do, showing how we're going to do things fundamentally differently. And so this is a question I would offer, maybe less for staff and more for council to consider. It's a question of relative priorities, and it has political dimensions. And it's not the thing you can obviously expect a professional staff to push on unless they have real direction from the elected leaders to say to go outside. It's okay to go outside the normal lines. And the final thing I'll just offer on this that I think represents our view from TAB is that I thought the council study session on climate a couple weeks ago was fantastic. And one of the implications is we need to do more and do more faster. But I'd just like to offer that one of the key things that led to was the idea of doing modeling in a study. And what a study is going to give you is this exact type of a decision on your desk. So if you really want to move on climate, here you have today. No need for deep modeling. You've got an opportunity. So from that, I'll step down and just wanted to offer that from TAB, we think the staff is great, or at least I think the staff is great. I'll speak for myself, and just want to make sure that the council knows what they have here. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that, Ryan. And apologize for pronouncing your last name wrong before. So unless anybody has questions for Ryan, I can proceed with my questions.
I have questions for Ryan.
Okay, go for it. Sorry, Mary, I'll go back over to Mary.
Mary, is it okay if I ask Ryan a question?
Yeah, it's okay. Aaron actually had the floor for questions, but if Aaron is ceding his questions to others, that's fine.
As long as I get it back after we're done with Ryan.
Okay.
I just had a question for Ryan. I'll wait my turn. That's okay. Go ahead.
No. Please ask Ryan your question. I just want to ask the staff questions after you're done.
Sure, so do I. So Ryan, thanks for all of that exhortation to do more. And as a person who's studied this a lot, could you tell us, like, just to put a fine point on it, what would you do as far as the 3 recommendations we're looking at tonight? So we've got neighborhood parking management. We're looking at setting prices for 3 different categories. We've got fines, and we've got kind of downtown paid parking. So you've exhorted us. Could we get a dollar figure for what you would do for those? Or would you like us to, you mentioned also that we could do a study and the study would tell us that we need to do more. I'm just curious if you have any detail behind that, or if it's just a general lean in kind of comment.
Mary, thank you for that. I'll give you my take. I hesitate to make this, be something Tab would necessarily say, but I'll give you a few ideas. One, $1,000. I think that sounds reasonable. For
a day or an hour or a year.
I'm sorry, I should specify. A lot of the discussion has been on the neighborhood parking pricing. So right now it's at $17 a year. So couple of cups of coffee to store your on your private vehicle for a year, and it would move to 50 something. I think 1,000 seems like a pretty good start. I mean, that's $100 a month to store your car. A lot of cities, people pay $150, $250 a month to store their car. Again, people are free to park wherever they want. That would be one starting point. Second starting point would be
Can I interrupt? You said that, I assume that's for the residential. So then we've got the commuter, which is about $420 a year or so. Would you keep the commuter at the staff recommendation? Would you go higher for that? It's car storage too, right?
Right. So you just using round numbers here, but sure. I mean, I'm in that sense. I think $100 or so ish a month for both of them. I think it's not unreasonable. It's not taking away people's parking. They're still free to park in their driveways for free and so on. So if you just want a dollar figure, I'll give you that. I think another thing you consider is Paris. Who's been to Paris loves to go to Europe. They just announced plans to cancel half of their on-street parking. So that's another thing to think about is just getting rid of about half of it. You could also think about it from a square footage perspective. Think about it, $50 a foot, it's about 200 square feet per parking spot. Just think about what what you'd expect for business to pay, for a business lease. I think that's another starting point.
Okay, and anything on fines or downtown parking rates?
Thank you. We were actually been quite focused on or at least I have been through this, pretty focused on the parking rates itself. I do think one point on fines is to take, I think there's a national kind of awakening to the challenges that happen when you have cars parked in bike lanes and keeping, forcing vulnerable road users to swerve out of the way of trucks and cars and SUVs. That's a good place to be more aggressive with parking and taking it seriously. If you have a motor vehicle that was left in the middle of the street and people had to drive around it, that would be taken pretty seriously, I would say to start to consider that the philosophy for block bike lanes.
So any kind of concrete, so you say serious fines for blocking bike lanes. Do you have an idea of what that might be, like for us to kick around tonight?
Well, thank you. So, we purposely didn't come in with like a rebuttal to everything. So I'm afraid that I don't have a specific, but I would say you might tow the car, treat it the same as you would if it was in the middle of a lane.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Okay, so a few questions for staff. One is, one of the things that's not on our agenda tonight is the parking code update in the planning department, and understand the staffing issues there. But since a lot of our parking policy in the city kind of revolves around that, a lot of our aspirations might be achieved through that. Do we have a sense, is there anybody from the planning department who has a sense of when we're going to be able to get to that?
I'm not sure if we have anybody from planning on the call tonight, but I do believe that they are working to focus on that for their 2020 work plan at this point, but I don't want to speak for them. Does anybody else, Chris or Erica?
Yeah. What I've heard is, let's try and get it on next year's work plan, so 2022.
And the intent had been to make sure that that work was moving forward in conjunction with the work that we presented with you tonight, and just, unforeseen circumstances. We are not able to be in that position today, but we will very much look forward to that work coming soon.
And I would just add real quick that, we've already done a lot of data collection on the parking code changes, granted COVID, post-COVID, but I think we have a good foundation. And we've also already developed a lot of preliminary recommendations for consideration. So I think once we start, we can hit the ground running and come very quickly with recommendations on parking code changes. I think the key factor is, what has been the impact of COVID? And that may take a little bit to understand.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, not that anybody from the planning department needed to be here for this item, but that's helpful to understand, because I think like I say, a lot of our aspirations in this area, I think, can be achieved through that program or that policy, those policy changes. So next question is on the neighborhood parking permit. Can you refresh my memory as to how many permits do people get, both kind of year-round and guest access with that program?
Sure. So we don't limit the number of permits extensively. I think we allow 3 permits outright with the program for a resident who can demonstrate that they live there, and they purchase one for each vehicle. And so that will get the price for those permits will go up. And then each household or demonstrated resident gets 2 visitor permits included with their household permit to hand out to friends, folks who are staying temporarily for house cleaning, a project, or a visitor for a short period of time. And then they're also eligible for guest permits. Up to 2 weeks of permits are allowed for free per year for them to register a guest to be able to park on the street for an extended amount of time on their block.
So the guest permits are time limited. Are those visitor permits time limited? I mean, could you use them sort of 24/7, or would there be a restriction on that?
So they are, so yeah, there's 2 permits allowed, and they're not time restricted in the sense of when our parking enforcement officers see a visitor permit, they'll certainly pay attention and see it. If that car stays there in that same spot beyond the allowable number of hours, which is largely 72 hours, then even though they have a visitor permit, they would still be ticketed for leaving their vehicle in a residential zone or in the public right of way for too long without moving.
Right. Well, those are the rules that apply citywide, right? I've meant sort of specifically around the visitor permit. Would there be a period of time at which they would say, hey, this isn't really a visitor?
We do not currently have those type of restrictions. I'm getting a note from one of my staff. So visitor permits can be used for 24 hours on a block of the residence.
Okay. Thanks. And so these new, or the pricing that we currently have and that we're proposing to increase, that's a per permit price rather than a per household price?
I want to confirm that, but I have to get 2 permits max per resident if they have 2 vehicles registered to them, and I believe it is a per permit price.
Got it. And do we charge it all for those visitor permits?
Say that one more time. No, the visitor permits are included with the price of your resident permit.
Got it. Okay. And then on the pricing increase, the proposal is to increase that gradually over the next, I think, 3 years to get to that cost recovery level of $50. And then you mentioned the possibility of increasing it to the point where there'd be some additional revenue that we could use on other programs, like other transportation demand management program kind of things. Would we have to kind of specifically, how could we make that happen? Like, do we have to come back in 2024 and talk about it again? Or could we give direction to say, you know what, build that into these tiers that you're going to increase? So if we wanted to do that, what would be the path there?
So our intent is over the next couple of years, as we're increasing these rates and doing the key performance indicators and measures, is identifying the various parking management tools that we want to make available that are customized to the conditions. And so we would anticipate that we're going to continue to have conversations with our boards and commissions tab and you all on what those specific management tools could look like. And again, similar to what transportation mobility does with the neighborhood speed management program, is on an annual basis, we would share what we have learned as far as our data collection and our recommended parking management strategies, where I think we acknowledge that the NPP as it currently exists was designed to mitigate a certain type of parking spillover that occurs adjacent to our managed districts. And it's not necessarily the most appropriate tool for parking challenges in other parts of the city that might have intensifying land uses or they're adjacent to a trailhead. So what we really want to do is model our approach after what was done with CAMP, where we identify a specific set of strategies that might work better for that area of town, as opposed to just identifying the current NPP approach of these residential permits plus visitor and guest permits made available because you have a parking problem. Because what we've learned from a number of our focus groups with NPPs is folks have entered into the program, they permitted to be a part of it, and discovered that it did not actually solve or make a significant change to their unique challenges. And what we really want to move toward is a more customized approach based on those key performance indicators. And so that is still going to evolve. If that's the direction that we're receiving from you all tonight, our intent is to evolve those tools.
Okay, thanks very much. That's all my questions. I'll have comments later. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron. Next is Bob.
Thank you. I just have one question relating to parking garages. First, I want to disclose that my wife's great-grandfather opened the very first parking garage for motor vehicles in Boston on May 24, 1898. You can look it up. His name is Thomas McCulloch. It cost $1 a day, which was a lot of money back then. My question, I didn't quite follow the memo on what we're going to do on parking pricing for parking garages. I know we have the 3 for 3 for 3 program, which is great, and I know it's been very successful. Currently, I think we have free parking on the weekends. Is that, I understood from the memo that's going to shift a little bit. Could you walk us through that again?
Yes, so the changes in parking garages will be, first, we're going to keep the $1.25 rate for now because we want parking in garages to be cheaper than on street. Currently, if you stay in a downtown garage beyond 4 hours, the rate increases to $2.50 per hour. So if you leave your vehicle in there for an extended amount of time, it becomes even more expensive to a total daily max of $55. So we're working to adjust those rates because we want to encourage people to utilize the off-street assets that we have, so we can understand how that dynamic is going to play out with our on-street assets. And so we're keeping the $1.25 in the garages. We are going to implement a flat rate. If you stay after 6 hours, then you're more like a long-term permit holder. And we don't want a long-term stay to be cheaper than our permits that we sell, because then we will lose a lot of customers on our permit front. So that's one change that we detail. The other change, as you mentioned, Bob, was the $3 evening rate will continue. $3 from 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. Monday through Friday. Our intent is to extend that $3 flat rate throughout the weekend as well. So if you come on a weekend, it will no longer be free, but regardless of the duration of your day stay, it will be $3.
Okay, thanks. And so that, just on that last bit, so that $3 will kick in from 3 o'clock on a Friday to 3 a.m. on the following Monday, effectively?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Precisely.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. That's all I had.
Thanks, Bob. Next up is Sam.
Thank you, guys. Great comprehensive presentation. Much appreciated, Chris and Chris. A couple quick questions. You focused on the neighborhood parking permit first. You talked about the price adjustments, and then you also talked about potentially eliminating some neighborhood parking programs or having them redo petitions. And so I wasn't clear, first of all, if the price increase is independent of the concept of eliminating or adding to NPPs. That's just something you're proposing to do straight away, right?
Correct.
And the fundamental purpose of that, it seems like, is financial stability for the program. Is that correct?
Well, to meet the pricing goal, so one of our goals was to achieve cost recovery, and looking to previous pricing strategies, it's been $17 for residents for quite some time. And so while that might have been the appropriate price in 1994 to make sure we were achieving cost recovery for the program, having not increased that over time, we are no longer in that space. So that is the primary cause of increasing the rate for the existing NPP as it stands. The additional petitions would be if there were other tools that were identified based on the data collection that we will be doing that might warrant maybe the addition of on-street pay stations in a residential zone, similar to what we've done near Chautauqua. We wouldn't just outright put those out there on the street without working with the neighborhood. We would present that as a tool based on data collection as maybe an appropriate next step for neighborhood parking management, and then work with them to determine if they want it, then it will be through a petition process that they would resubmit. So for instance, Whittier would maintain their NPP as it currently exists until we might identify other strategies that could be deployed in Whittier, but it would still, based on, again, direction that we've received from council, and this was a question that we had for you earlier in the year, of what is the right way to involve the communities and neighborhoods in these decisions we're making in residential areas. And the direction that we had received previously was that a neighborhood petition process was still desired rather than a staff-driven delivery of change in neighborhood parking management. So that's in a large part where that comes from.
Got it. I'll come back to that at comments, but that's very clarifying. Thank you for that. Then the other question I have is, you talked about key performance indicators, and the one that was mentioned was 15% vacant parking spots is kind of a sweet spot that you shoot for. So you adjust your pricing until you hit that sweet spot. Are there other key performance indicators that you would use when you have a look at pricing besides just the vacancy rate, or is that, like, you talk about multiple, but is that the one that you're really focused on?
That I'd say that's the primary goal, and I might call on Mallory, our consultant at Walker, who really was instrumental in developing the nuances of these strategies. I would say that is our number one factor. The other element, of course, is going to be the overall utilization in the districts. For instance, what's happening in the garages. If we're filling up the garages and the streets outside the garages are maintaining a 15% vacancy, then we're going to have an imbalance there in our assets. And that means that we need to make an adjustment to our garage prices to be higher, which then will translate into changes that we need to make on street to maintain that balance. But Mallory, I'm wondering if you might have anything else to add on that front.
Sure, thanks, Chris, and thank you, Sam, for that question. So on the neighborhood parking management side, as Chris mentioned, the primary key performance indicators that we would use in terms of existing conditions are the parking supply and the utilization, because that really tells us if a parking issue that needs to be solved is present. Another indicator that we would use on a more proactive level is trip generation that's generated by new development. So that's an area where the planning department and this effort are really working in tandem and working in coordination. So one thing that we heard in our project process and through our board and commission effort is that the planning department frequently hears about parking and the need to solve parking problems that are sort of preemptive when new development is on the horizon, but they really don't have a recourse for that. So in this case, a key performance indicator would be a trip generation cap for new development and the subsequent condition that that new development is not providing its own parking or sufficient parking per the code. So that means that it would trigger a review and potential for a neighborhood parking permit program to be looked at in that neighborhood, given that that new development might cause or is likely to cause that condition where there is a parking challenge. Another sort of secondary indicator that we are looking at is transit richness and access in the neighborhood. So in a residential area where parking management is being considered as an option, we will also want to look at the access richness, so a combination of walk score, bike score, and transit score to see if parking and single occupancy vehicles are truly the primary necessary mode for mobility in an area. And that kind of draws on the equity piece as well. Thanks,
So
Chris.
how would you use that latter one, which sounds pretty interesting? So if you've got an area like Whittier, which has got lots of transit nearby, bikeable, walkable, would you have a higher price for an NPP in that area? Would you have a higher on-street parking price? Like, how would you use transit walkability to interface with your management of your parking system?
So right now, and sorry, Chris, it's okay if I continue to answer this question. Right now, we're not we're not recommending specific price differentials based on access score in the implementation action plan. We're more recommending it as a consideration tool, because part of this is, staff and the city are responsible for prioritizing and areas and determining which areas are eligible for the neighborhood parking management program. So right now, the petition is really the only tool used to determine eligibility for a neighborhood parking permit program. This requires some additional robust knowledge in order for staff and elected and appointed officials to consider that prioritization. We certainly could look at some price differentials based on access richness, but that's not included in these steps currently.
Right, and so what I'd like to follow up with that on is we have not yet identified what additional tools, the myriad of additional tools we intend to make available in a neighborhood. But one thing that could be considered in a neighborhood that currently has neighborhood parking management that's focused primarily just on this residential parking versus spillover parking. But if they perform really well on access to bike share, car share, or transit, that there could be a tool that includes delivery of memberships to B-Cycle and maybe a neighborhood eco pass subsidy or some other benefit that has a cost to it. And so the cost of the program in Whittier would certainly be different than the cost to a program in a neighborhood that might have some parking challenges, but they don't have the same level of access to tools that cost us money to deliver more value for their higher priced products. So it wouldn't be strictly because they're parked up and there's a lot of people that are spilling over in their neighborhood that we would want to increase those prices and say, oh, we have transit, so it's more expensive. But how do we make sure that if we're going to charge more for one neighborhood versus another neighborhood, what is the added value to the program that they are getting outside of the the same product, just a different price because their KPIs are different.
Got it. That's super helpful. But it seems to me like price and, as you say, services are the key reaction to whatever KPIs that you're monitoring. So that's all great. One more question. So looking at fines and looking at the fines for, what do you call it, mobility safety fines, which I appreciate. I always hate having to go into traffic around the delivery vehicles. However, those delivery vehicles are performing a service that people greatly appreciate when they're receiving their packages. So I was kind of curious how you're looking at the balance between community vitality and, you know, curb management versus mobility safety fines, because I personally would love to never come across a delivery vehicle in the bike lane, but it happens all the time, and there are people who want those deliveries. So I'm just kind of curious what the thinking is on how to balance those two competing interests.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that, and I know that our friends in transportation mobility would probably share on that as well, but that's really our curbside management work. It's acknowledging, even if we have these higher priced gold parking rate zones where it might be as much as $5 per hour to park, they might still not have space available on those blocks for deliveries or curbside pickup, drop off for whatever purpose. And so that's where we want to make sure we're dialing in on our curbside management effort to really take a closer look at the provision of these priority spaces that we've mentioned in that strategy, to designate, make sure that there is designated space on those high demand corridors, that we can mitigate that to the greatest extent possible. We're not going, I mean, I always say a parking problem is a good problem to have, but it doesn't make it any less challenging and frustrating on all this competition for space. And so that is something that we are looking at in curbside management. And so we will certainly be talking more with you on that in the months ahead. Chris, anything else you want to add on that?
I'd just like to add, you know, one of the ideas in curbside management is to identify locations, you know, that could be like throughout our downtown in Cajun, that are flexible loading zones, you know, loading zones that could be used by commercial vehicles, your Cisco truck delivering food during the morning hours, but then later transition into a Lyft or Uber pickup or drop off spot, or even a quick stop place where you can go if you've ordered food and you've got curbside delivery of that food. So I think looking at how we develop those flexible spaces, that way you limit the actual number of these loading zones and you use them most efficiently. I think that is a key. I think another key, especially in some of our areas like our downtown, is maximizing use of our alleyways. You know, I see, you know, from our curbside management inventory that we've already started on, we've been working on that prior to receiving the grant, you know, we could make greater use of these alleyways for some of those deliveries as well, to eliminate some of the problems that you mentioned, Sam.
Great, thanks.
All right, thanks, Sam. Next up, we have Junie, followed by Rachel, and then Adam. Junie?
Thank you, Mary. I have quite a few questions going back to violations, the increase of fines for parking violations. And I'm looking at the memo, but I don't see how do you intend to issue these citations? Is it based on, for instance, you mentioned in the memo, give me a second, I'm pulling it up. You mentioned violations around public safety, but also people parking. For instance, if someone were to park at a meter, is it the same amount as someone, let's say, who parked maybe on a bike lane? Are you looking at it that way, or are you just looking at a universal parking violation that is $30?
No, we have a number. I'm not sure of the total number. I think there are 42 different parking related violations that our enforcement officers look to as people are behaving badly in the right of way. And so those basic or standard violations, such as overtime at a meter, that would be treated a lot differently than someone who's blocking a driveway or a bike lane or impacting other people's ability to move around safely would be considered differently. And so the fine schedule would be adjusted depending on the type of violation that is being experienced.
Okay, from what I'm hearing from you, it would be because in the memo you mentioned that CU charges between $35 to $60. So you're saying we would increase our fees and it would probably be on that medium of $30 to $60. And if you are at a meter, it could be that the lower 30. And if you parked in a bike lane, it could be that 60.
Correct.
Okay, okay, thank you. I also have a question about the repeat offender because I've traveled and I've lived in many places and I have gotten a lot of, well, let's just say my fair share of parking violations. And I wanted to know from you, what is the process for repeat offenders and what is the thought behind either increasing the fine, and do we have any research that somehow increasing the fine as the person, you know, how that data impact behavior basically?
Yeah, so what we've found from members of our community is that with our current standard fine of $15, there is a high willingness to take chances because $15 doesn't seem like all that much, and they're willing to press their luck. And every now and then they're going to get caught and they're going to pay their $15 and they're going to keep doing it over and over again. And so we're trying to implement a fine structure that discourages folks pressing their luck and it improves their likelihood to be compliant and pay for parking like everybody else that chooses to participate in our management program. And so that's really part of the intent of the graduated fines is those repeat offenders. We have usual suspects, and that's what we hear from them over and over again. And then we have folks that they get that one ticket and they change their behavior, and that we don't have that repeat issue. That's also what we've heard from our partners at the university. Their approach is your first violation is always a warning. If it's the first time that their enforcement officers have approached you, automatic warning. If they see you do it again, then you get a ticket, as opposed to the first time you do it, you're automatically in trouble and you're automatically paying a fine. And so that's another thing that we're intending to do is we all make mistakes. But if there are folks that are feeling more willing to just do it over and over again and take their chances, we don't want to send the message that that's okay. It's going to be the same price over and over again.
Yeah, no, I hear you, but I'm wondering, aside from the university you mentioned, have you seen any city around the country where people get one ticket? Because as I mentioned to you, I'm speaking from experience here, having gotten 1 or 2 tickets going downtown and parking and not parking properly, but I've never remember, whereas, oh, your ticket is $20, but because you got a second ticket, now it's $40. I've never seen that before, or I've never heard of it before. So I'm wondering if you have best practices around somewhere.
Yeah, maybe Valerie, you can speak to the communities that employ the graduated fines, which is a strategy that is used in a number of places.
Yeah, and one of Donald Troup's principles.
Yeah, first I'll say that this is a pretty standard parking management principle, just because for the reasons that Chris is saying, and really based on the data in Boulder, about 25% of your violators are these repeat offenders. And while 75% are just first-time violators and then they change their behavior, 25% is a big chunk. So they're really having a detriment on the parking system. And what happens is, and I'll answer your actual question, Junie, in a moment. I'm sorry to delay it further, but what happens is it erodes the ability of your existing parking supply to meet demand. So instead of serving many people in the day, one space is serving maybe only one person because they're violating the meter, they're not paying. And of course, the enforcement officers are incapable of towing vehicles, multiple times per day. Of course, the enforcement officers don't want to do that. So that's, why these graduated rates are helpful. The equity concern is there, but really what we want to do is get these specific 25% of people to change their behaviors while giving people appropriate parking options so they can follow the rules. And that's really what we want people to do. We don't want to make this a revenue grab. We want people to follow the rules. And that's the goal here. Seattle and Portland both have graduated parking violation fines. I might call on my colleague, Chrissy Jones, to see if she knows of any of our municipalities in Colorado that have graduated fines. I think Greeley does, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
I believe Greeley did implement, I want to say 2 years ago with the graduated fines, and then Claremont, California also employs graduated parking fines.
So there are a number of communities that have them, and there are others. I'd be happy to provide council with a broader list as well. I just am not sure of any more off the top of my head.
Thank you for this. My last question is, and I think it's probably I'm having a hard time understanding the commuter fees or of $400 per year. I'm trying to understand, is that something new we're trying to implement? Because of the way it is written in the memo, it seems like it's either something that's been around, it's something new, so I can't quite figure it out.
Yeah, so traditionally we know that we have on-street capacity in the residential areas surrounding our downtown University Hill CU managed districts. And so we do sell commuter permits, we have for some time, for folks who would rather pay the $400 a year to park on street in a neighborhood while they're at work versus the $1,800+ a year for a permit in one of our downtown garages, because that's their alternative. So it's an affordable alternative that has helped us to achieve cost recovery in the NPP zones that are surrounding our managed districts. We don't have a lot of commuter permits sold in our NPP zones that are farther away from these managed employment centers.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. I think this is great. And I know we're saving comments for later. I noticed the part when you talked about community connectors and the memo. I really appreciate that, again, because it takes into account community members and diverse communities and people we probably wouldn't hear from. But as you were talking about the parking, and I'm sure that's probably something that you are already doing, because again, you are the expert here and you're probably sleeping thinking about all this, but just for my understanding, as part of the work, how closely are you working with either the chamber or small businesses when it comes to all these parking changes and the impact it will have on a lot of the people who are commuting here because of a lack of affordable housing?
Thank you for that question. We do have representatives from the Boulder Chamber on our Access Allies team, so they've been participating with us throughout the process. We also have a very close relationship with the Downtown Boulder Partnership, and I'll be going to their public policy meeting here in a couple of weeks just to present to them where we're at with these strategies and with feedback from council to make sure that we're bringing that community, the business community, along with this work for sure.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much, Chris and the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Junie. Next up, Rachel.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And Junie's last questions were a great segue into mine. So first question is, looks, if I understand it, we're looking at pricing for 3 different types of permits, residential, commuter, and business. I understand residential, but want to make sure I understand where the permits get people parking in the other 2 categories. So for both of them, are we talking about permits for neighborhood parking to a neighborhood permit to park on a particular street?
Correct. So both of them are permits that are localized to specific block faces. The commuter permit is made available to, for instance, downtown employees who don't want to pay for a permit in a garage. They are eligible, if we have space and capacity, to purchase a commuter permit in specific block faces. But they're the last on the totem pole as far as permit availability. The business permit is for, there are a few small businesses that exist within our current MPP zones. So it's old, like little pocket business retail centers where they have employees that they need to make sure that they have parking nearby. So that's that business permit that's priced a little bit differently. And I think we have maybe, and Mallory knows the exact number, but a dozen of those types of permits.
Okay. And so I maybe don't understand then what the difference, like 75 versus 400 for the business versus commuter, and the business one's not going up at all, and the other 2 are. So I'm just trying to understand how you got to that outcome. I understand it sounds like it doesn't impact a lot of permits, but wanted to understand that better. And then, well, I guess I'll start there.
Yeah, so largely they're not a huge burden on our parking supply. They're already paying more than residents. And again, the commuter permit is made available to folks who have access to eco passes. They're employed by downtown businesses. They have other options available to them. And that is not something that we make available to businesses that are in these neighborhood zones. And so given that they're already paying more than residents, and that increasing the rate would be inconsequential to our ability to get to cost recovery. It's not being proposed that we increase. We can certainly entertain it if you feel like we want to make sure that we're asking everybody to pay a little bit more. But that was really the reasoning behind why we're not making changes there.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand it. It sounds like maybe the businesses are giving those permits to staff, but then some staff then get those permits kind of for free, and others are paying $400 a month, but those others get some other options that these employees don't get.
Right. Well, these are employees that are in a business. I'm trying to think of a really good example of a small business that's in a neighborhood zone, maybe in near Goss Grove, where it's I don't know if Backcountry Pizza is a good example, but it's a business that's in a neighborhood zone. And so we treat them and their employees, and they only get access to 3 permits. We treat them a little bit differently than we would a business that's in Caged District that has other benefits available to them, and yet they still choose to park in neighborhoods and contribute to the spillover challenge. Where these businesses, their employees aren't necessarily part of a spillover challenge, they're part of general just use of on-street spaces near their place of business.
Okay, that helps. Thank you. And then, so for the people who are using the commuter permits, and I understand that they have some of these other caged options that you're talking about, if I'm using the right language there. Nonetheless, I imagine a lot of them are coming into Boulder to kind of provide the services that we all need, and they work for employers in those districts who don't have on-site parking available to them. So question is for the Access Allies team, were there members of that group who solely represented kind of the working class or commuters, which I think could be a little bit different than the business owner perspective?
That's a really good question, and I don't know that our Access Allies was where we would have had those conversations, but we did have a number of focus groups in our conversations with the community connectors. Mallory, I would love to hear from you a little bit more on your thoughts on that question.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel, for that question. So we did have community connectors who worked on both phases of the project, and we had the pleasure of continuation with that group of community connectors that we had in our work in 2020, continue working with us in 2021. So at the that was, I think we had 5 community connectors and we had 6 meetings with them over the course of the project work. That effort was at the onset primarily. We were talking about their transportation behaviors and how they make transportation choices. And a major issue that they brought up was parking, pricing, availability of affordable parking in the downtown core. Many of them make trips to the downtown core for errands, for shopping, for their work. And so, you know, the ability to drive and park somewhere at a reasonably affordable price was hugely important to them. Another issue that they brought up was making sure that if we, you know, that we had some subsidy opportunities for these types of commuter permits. And we actually have specific subsidy options that are discussed in the implementation and action plan that would be income qualifications based and tied to existing social services programs that the city of Boulder has. So the second part of our work in 2021 with those community connectors was really asking some pretty targeted questions around what would those subsidies look like, to what extent should they be subsidized, and those specifically focused on those commuter options, Rachel, that you're talking about. So people coming into work, how can we, you know, offer them something affordable so that we don't impede their ability to work in the city of Boulder and contribute to our community. So that's expressed in the implementation and action plan. So the prices that are included in the presentation are the straight unsubsidized prices. So those would be available to people that are, you know, able to pay that price. And then we have some recommendations for subsidies that would be available on an income qualification basis. And again, tied to programs that like the food tax rebate program, I think is one that we mentioned, and other programs that the city of Boulder already implements that are income qualified.
Thanks. Okay, I appreciate that. It may or may not have made sense, but it feels a little bit siloed. Like if the community connectors, you know, were sort of separately consulted, and then there's a group that's Access Allies that just, maybe it's a little bit siloed from the group dynamic discussion. Next, just a question on board feedback. I very much appreciate Tab looking hard at the climate impacts, and Ryan Schuhard, if I'm saying it right, advocating for that. But it did make me wonder, you know, the focus on the climate impacts, if we consulted the Environmental Advisory Board, they were asked to weigh in on this, or if they should be, and kind of the same question for HRC on equity impacts. Excuse me.
So we have not consulted with them in a formal manner, as we have with the boards and commissions for our management districts and TAB and planning board, just given their direct connection to parking policy. It doesn't mean that we can't. I'd say we're happy to get more feedback from different perspectives on this work as we are finalizing our 2022 work plan.
Okay, all right, that's all my questions for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Adam?
Thanks, Mary. Sorry, I have no video tonight. I have a poor internet connection, so let me know if you can't hear me. My main question is, all these policies, they're only as good as the enforcement. So are we going to be stepping up enforcement in any way along with these policies, or is it sort of the same level of enforcement just with different rules? What's the general take there?
That's a really good question, and that's part of why we've been really careful about how much we're proposing we want to implement in 2022. We're not communicating that we want to start installing new pay stations in all commercial districts across the city, because that would generate some significant resource needs for an expanded enforcement. So our enforcement team is ready and prepared to address the changes in the the types of violations and fines and looking out for those things. Mallory has done a great job of meeting regularly with all the different work groups that have various responsibilities in implementing all these changes. And so they are certainly prepared. One of the big changes that we've implemented in our enforcement team recently is expansion of license plate recognition capability, which is going to be leading to significant efficiencies in our ability to not require someone to park a vehicle and walk and look at receipts in people's windshields, or enter a license plate into their handheld devices to determine whether or not they have a valid parking session. So we have been implementing a number of efficiencies in that operation, and we'll be able to take advantage of that to not just do better enforcement in our managed districts, but do much better data collection in support of the development of these KPIs, where previously, in order to do a great data collection analysis for the implementation of neighborhood parking management, we need to have people walk through that neighborhood and count cars in the middle of the night, various hours of the day, to get a broad perspective of what's going on street. And it required a lot of time and energy. And now it'll be very easy for us to utilize our license plate recognition. It'll still require us to collect data in the middle of the night, but we can do it much more effectively and efficiently. So that's been part of the conversation, and Mallory's done a great job of making sure that everything that we are proposing is going to be able to be implemented by our existing teams with minimal expansion of resources.
That's great to know. Along those lines, so I know this is going to be a tough question to answer, but I know there's some point where there are diminishing returns for the amount of people that you staff to, have fines, and along those lines, do you think you've sort of met that point? Do you know where that spot is? Or would additional staff actually generate the additional revenue in some ways?
At this point, we are appropriately staffed for the amount of coverage required for parking management in both neighborhoods and our managed districts. I would say that the challenge would be if we expand regular coverage. For instance, if we had a parking district in Gun Barrel and that included neighborhoods surrounding the Gun Barrel town center, then that would likely require additional staff and additional fleet. And that's where our challenge will be is right now our workspace that we house our enforcement officers out of, where they have lockers and showers and those types of things. The more we expand the coverage and the amount of area that they need to be enforcing and the number of staff we would require to do that effectively, then we would certainly find ourselves running up against existing workspace and fleet limitations. So not that we couldn't step up and meet those demands, it would just get more expensive, and we'd have to certainly keep track of that level of effectiveness versus the return.
Understood, but currently you think you're sort of near maximum effectiveness based on those diminishing return ideas?
I don't know that we included that level of analysis in this specific work. I feel really good about my team's capabilities and where they're at right now. And I don't know that, Mallory, in your discussions with our proposed steps forward, that there were any concerns raised by our enforcement team on that front. But in short, yes, I feel good about where we're at in our capacity to take on a little bit more on the enforcement side. But it's certainly something that we will continue to track. And in the event that we identify that we need to expand our enforcement staff, acknowledging that they do bring in more money for the organization in the general fund than it costs to pay them, that's certainly something that we would want to follow very closely.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mallory. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I can add just a little bit more color, I suppose. I think so Chris mentioned the meetings that we had with staff teams. We had 2 sets of pretty intensive meetings with individual staff teams, noting that AMPS is a hugely interdepartmental effort that requires a lot of staff liaising and manpower or person power. I'm sorry. So when we first talked about these recommendations, we had individual meetings with the enforcement and muni courts team, both of whom said this is doable. And then when we were developing the implementation and action plan, we again met with enforcement and muni courts, in addition to many other staff teams, to make sure that this was implementable. They're confident about their staffing capabilities and also confident about the software and technology capabilities. That was a huge consideration, given that we're adding a bit more nuance and complexity to how we're issuing fines. So the city's current software package is capable of doing this work without any upgrades. So that was very, very important to us. We looked at staffing in the next couple years, the immediate term, 2022, and near term and mid to long term, and we're not projecting any big overhauls or staff adds to get this work done. As Chris mentioned, this does require some additional proactive study of whether parking management needs to be extended to other parts of the city. So of course, that might necessitate some more enforcement officials, but for now, we're feeling quite confident about the staff levels that we have to get these implementation and action steps done in the next year and then in the next several years.
Great, thank you both. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Adam. Junie, looks like your hand is up again.
Yeah, I just have a few questions, and I think part of it as well is me thinking on the type of feedback I want to give you when we get to that point. And I see that in the memo, it says that parking revenues generated are sufficient to pay for current expenses associated with the parking program and other transportation demand management access initiatives led by the city. So, and I hear everything that you said to Adam earlier, and I believe it was Mallory who mentioned that increasing the fees from 20 to closer to the CU violation amount, which is between $35 to $60, is not a way to raise revenue, but a way to curtail behaviors. But nonetheless, we will have more money than before. So I'm trying to figure out what will this money be used for. And I looked in the memo really quickly. I did not see your annual revenue coming from violations. So I'm sure that's going to be a substantial amount from what it used to be to what it will be. And I just want to know, what will that money be used for?
So we in Community Vitality and Transportation and Mobility do not have the benefit of receiving those resources into our operating budgets. And so we certainly are making sure that as the finance and budget folks are working through the 2022 budget, that they can take into consideration these proposed changes in their overall budget outlook for 2022. I know they are taking a more conservative approach just because parking behavior has not returned back to 2019 levels. I would love if there is anybody from finance that is on the call right now that wants to share where they're at with this right now. I do know that we are in conversations with them to make sure that it's included in your overall 2022 budget conversation. It's not money that we are in a position to propose how you spend it. We do have asks coming in the 2022 budget directly associated with the implementation of these strategies. Michelle Scans was an awesome project manager in Community Vitality that helped us through this work, but she left us for a private sector job a couple months ago. And so we certainly know that we need some help in Community Vitality to help make these things happen. But the general fund allocation will be determined and considered among the broader needs of the community.
Thank you.
Is that all, Junie? Anything else?
Thank you, Marian. Thank you, Chris.
All right. Any other questions for staff? Seeing none, I have a couple. one of the lines of questioning from one of my colleagues had to do with the delivery vehicles and how and the response was that you'll have these zones and where people can park to make their deliveries. There are other mobile businesses, and I was curious to know what you found out in your outreach to the mobile businesses, people who are doing yard work or are doing housekeeping, things like that, where they have to pull down equipment or carry things back and forth. What kinds of accommodations were made for those businesses in terms of the curbside management and fines and things like that?
So thank you very much, Mary, for that question. We did hear you loud and clear at our previous study session earlier this year on the need to reach out to those businesses specifically. And the project team did have some focus group or a survey that was sent out specifically to those types of businesses, neighborhood-based mobile businesses. Mallory, I would love to hear from you if you want to provide a high-level overview of that conversation. And then we also are proposing a new mobile-based business parking permit product in this work. And so I'd love to hear maybe Mallory, if you want to share more about that detail.
Yes, thank you. So we did a number of outreach specifically to mobile businesses as well as NPP holders who employ mobile business owners via survey or questionnaire, I guess is the technical term. And then we did we did three, I believe, NPP focus groups with NPP permit holders. And that included some questioning around how they currently use or have mobile businesses park when they're conducting services at their home. So those were things like domestic, home cleaners, yard workers, contractors, et cetera. And what we learned was, to some extent, the existing visitor permit system is working for that purpose, but there really needs to be more differentiation between these mobile businesses that are frequenting these zones and doing work in these zones on a regular basis, so that they can have their own permit rather than always having to ask the person that they're working for the permit, that extra layer of communication and coordination. And sometimes, the contractor is coming to do work and the resident isn't there to assist them or help them. So that person ends up getting penalized for doing their work. So that's why one of the reasons why we wanted to have this separate product for them that would be priced identically to the existing business permit, and would have, similarly equal impacts on our cost recovery goals. And then the other consideration is we want to be able to track those permit types separately, because there's also been some issues with planning and permitting and building, granting permits to contractors who then have parking permits to work in the zones and kind of over permitting in those areas. So what happens is everyone on one street is getting their kitchen redone, let's say. And so you have, 4 or 5 contractors doing work in that area, and the customer service team doesn't have the ability to track those separately because they're using visitor permits or guest permits or permits that are already in the system. So that's, those are the issues that we heard and that we wanted to work to solve with this separate mobile business permit that would be priced similarly to the business permit and tracked separately, so those businesses would have their own opportunity to park in the neighborhoods.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that work. And then Ryan Schuchard from TAB, who was advocating for $1,000 NPP permits and to take a bolder move. I'm wondering, he also mentioned the climate study session that we had a couple of weeks ago. And as part of that climate study session, the other things that came up were that actions have to be systems changes and scalable, as well as the whole climate action focuses on equity and resilience. So what my question is for staff is, how does the work that you are doing here, how and or where does it run up against policies that are basically outside of our area of influence or change, and all of those intersections that were focused on in that study session?
That is an excellent question. And I'm wondering if Chris Hagelin wants to get some FaceTime, or I'm happy to speak to that a little bit.
Well, I guess, Mary, could you rephrase your question? I'm having a little difficulty following what you mean by outside of.
So what? So for example,
Give an example. Yes.
Yes. So for example, with our climate work, one of the things that we were up against was the 120% rule with solar. And that was one of the things that we were able to overcome through a partnership that kind of went outside the path that we were previously on. So I'm wondering, in order to achieve more of those climate goals that are being advocated for by TAB, then what do we run up against in terms of, say, state laws that are limiting what we can do? So say, for example, also, we can't control RTD. And there's only so much that we can do in terms of transit. So what kinds of things of that sort do we run up against?
Right. Well, thank you for that clarification. So, when we look at the climate action plan and we look at the transportation sector and we look at our goal of an 80% reduction, primarily, though, that reduction that we anticipate comes from two things: changes in CAFE standards, the automobile efficiency standards, and electric vehicle adoption. Those are two major sectors that we need to see progress in to meet that 80% reduction goal. And, we certainly can incentivize, electric vehicle adoption to some extent, maybe not so much locally. But CAFE standards, that's something that is completely outside. We had the Obama standards, and some of those were pulled back during the last administration. So I think those are two examples. Mode shift certainly is another factor to reach that 80% goal, but it is smaller compared to the progress we can make in electric vehicle adoption and CAFE standards. And one thing I just say is, parking management and parking pricing alone, while it is a tool, it is an effective tool for changing travel behavior, it is alone not sufficient to do so. We have to have a multimodal system that provides options for people that are competitive to the private automobile. And not just in terms of cost, but also in terms of reliability, in terms of convenience, frequency. And so that, what you said, that reminds me of RTD, right? I mean, we work closely with RTD staff, but we've seen RTD's financial position and we've seen services cut. You were on the PASS program working group with me. We saw changes made to the EcoPass programs, our master contracts in the districts, that have been detrimental to that and significantly increasing the cost. And now we have COVID. We have seen such a significant decrease in transit use, and so far we have not really seen the recovery. We're just now looking at some preliminary RTD service changes for the fall, and we are seeing some increases, but we're not seeing the increases that we need. And, you know, it reminds me of when Boulder County was doing their TMP and they received some data from cell phones. And that indicated that 60% of the trips on the diagonal were coming from Larimer and Weld County. Those are outside of our RTD service area. Those people are coming. And transit is never going to be a great option for those people in comparison to the private automobile. So I think those are the things, some of the things that we're running against that are somewhat outside of our control. You know, hopefully we can move forward with RTD and discussions about expanding our HOP model, which would provide more local control of our transit service. And I hope that we can make some progress with them on making changes again to our past program so that we can extend the benefits that we provide, say, through our neighborhood eco-pass program. We know it's not the most socially equitable program, but we know that there are options, especially through technology with mobile ticketing and the MyRide card, that we can make changes and hopefully change that. But it's going to take RTD's willingness and their financial input to make those changes. So those are, you know, some of the things that immediately come to mind.
And I want to maybe point out just more locally in consideration of the things that we do have control over in the city and the things that we don't. I mean, if we wanted to charge a lot more for parking in the downtown and University Hill and Boulder Junction, we don't have any control over how much Macerich charges for parking at their shopping center. And so that's another consideration that we want to be really careful and thoughtful about. And until we change our parking code and redevelopment happens, which translates into a different way of parking being managed on private property, we're not well positioned to have a lot of leverage when it comes to the nuances between the areas where free parking still is prolific, and we don't currently have any ability to change that.
Thank you, Chris and Chris. I appreciate those answers. Any other questions from council? Seeing none, we can move on to the comment phase. Would anybody like to kick us off? Seeing no hands? Aaron. And then Sam.
Since nobody else wanted to go first, I'll go ahead and dive in. Chris and Mallory and everyone else who's been working on this, thank you for years of effort and a very thoughtful approach to these problems. You know, you've come up with some really nuanced responses to challenging situations and difficulties. Appreciate the attention to Donald Shoup's great parking ideas. We wouldn't want to disappoint the Shoupistas in our community by not taking those ideas into account. So I think generally y'all are on the right track. It sounds like you've got a lot of work to do, right? I saw that each of these is going to require, looks like years of work to measure everything appropriately and tailor the next steps of the program. And I appreciate how you're thinking about doing that carefully and deliberately. So good luck with all that work. I do have a couple specific. So the number of permits that people are able to get is substantial, right? So they can use, by your answers, you know, can get up to 3 for their individual vehicles, plus their visitor passes and their guest passes. And so I think increasing the price for those is a reasonable thing to do, but it also seems like maybe we should include pricing for those visitor passes as well as for their per vehicle passes, particularly given that you're doing those new mobile business type parking passes, which, by the way, I think is a great idea, and I appreciate your attention to that issue. So it seems like part of right-sizing the fees for this program would be to include those additional passes, and I would say to make sure that each individual pass has its own separate cost, so that, you know, people can have 2 visitor passes if that's important to them, but it seems like having a cost for that would be appropriate. And then I'll say that, yeah, I appreciate you looking for cost recovery in that program, but it seems like in terms of making a little bit of a dent on climate issues with our parking policies here, that if we could go somewhat past cost recovery, in terms of, and not throwing all that necessarily straight into the general fund, but look at ways that we could, I think you talked about a transportation wallet in the packet, right? About being able to fund maybe some TDM measures with some additional revenue that could go right back into those neighborhoods or their adjacent areas to help improve multimodal access in ways that could take some additional pressure off of the neighborhood parking, while also encouraging non-motor vehicle approaches to transportation. So I get that, Chris, you had a good answer about, Chris Jones, you had a good answer about how you were going to be, going about this very carefully in terms of looking about what those price numbers should be over a few years. But I would go ahead and personally give the direction that I would like to see you build into that process a thought of how can we increase prices a little bit more and then fund some other TDM measures that can reduce our reliance on the single occupancy vehicle in town. So other than that, I feel like you all have a lot of work to do, and I look forward to the next steps. And also, if there's anybody from the planning department here, I really do look forward to working on our parking policy for our new projects, because I think that'll have a really big impact on again, reducing single occupancy vehicle use in the community. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. We have Sam and then Bob.
Thanks, Mary. I just want to say again that I think you've done a really nice job of breaking it down, the parking problem for us, into some bite-sized chunks, and you've got some good proposals. I would support all of them, generally speaking, starting with the neighborhood parking management price increases. And I think they're pretty substantial. I mean, they're not the 50x that we heard from TAB that might be good or so, but they are a 40% increase from one year to the next. The following year, it's a 30% increase year over year. The following year, it's a 25% increase year over year. So I think those are substantial. I wouldn't object to what Aaron talked about, as long as we got enough feedback from each of the parking permit areas themselves that they wanted to see that extra money used for some kind of TDM in their area. I think that's kind of a neat idea to do it that way. But I will say that from a climate perspective, it is an interesting concept to try and keep residents from parking near their home through increased prices, when those residents may well not commute very far, generally speaking. We have 110,000 people live in Boulder, 40,000 of those work in Boulder, another 20,000, give or take, commute out of Boulder to work. But by and large, it would appear to me that a lot of the folks who are part of the NPP programs don't necessarily commute with those cars a lot or very long distances. So one thing I'd ask, if we're going to have the neighborhood parking strategy be part of our climate response, is that we quantify that somehow. Like if you're increasing the price of the commuter parking passes by double, you probably would see a response in the number of commuters who bought those passes, right? But that wouldn't necessarily reduce their commute unless they were in other modes. So there's a question of other modes. And then I think a key point that was brought up in the idea of using parking as a climate tool is, what about all the private parking? So if we look at where 40% of our employment is out in the Flatirons Park area in East Boulder, almost all of that parking is private. And so if you wanted to make a dent in the commuting habits of people who worked in East Boulder, you'd have to address the private parking, much as Mace Ridge was mentioned, which will now be the site of our largest single office building in Boulder. And all of the people who will be working there will be parking in private parking areas and may not be paying anything for their parking. So it's nice that we want to really, hammer on the folks who are parking in their neighborhoods. But the question really needs to be asked, what's the bang for our buck? for the political capital that we're going to spend on any of this parking stuff, where are we getting the most climate response? And I would claim that we need to really seriously look at private parking and in commuters as maybe the first place for that. To Mary's point, which I thought was really good, we just signed a new transportation bill in the state, which is statewide, and which really will promote that EV adoption, Chris, that you were talking about. And I think that is an important step. To what extent can we do the same thing regionally with parking and transit? Like, is there a way that we can form a coalition regionally to do these same kinds of things at the same time, so that we don't hear complaints from businesses that you're making us less competitive than our neighboring communities who don't do this? So it's a super complex problem, because you can address the travel habits with parking pricing and maybe not really impact the carbon emissions piece very much, unless you think carefully about how you're directing your price increases. So I would just say that as a general comment. I also think that your idea of performance-based pricing for parking pricing, the gold, silver, and base, looks like a great way to go. And so I think you've done a nice job with that, and with fines as well. I mean, I really would like to, the one thing I certainly agreed with Mr. Shishard about was what we do in response to complaints of people parking in bike lanes. If it's a delivery truck, it's there and it's gone. But when it's somebody that parks there for half an hour, I kind of agree. I'd like to see that car towed. So I don't know what to do about that, but I think upping the fines is useful. I think making the fines for parking in a way that blocks buses or bikes is something that should be at the high end of the charges for that. So let me go to your questions and see what else. So there's the refined strategies, next step for implementation. I think you've done a great job reaching out. I think one of Rachel's suggestions of making sure that you're talking to some in-commuters, and maybe not the highest income in-commuters, because I think they can take care of themselves, but the middle and lower income in-commuters might be ones to hear from about how they'd react to strategies that are proposed. And I think I've made my response to the third bullet, how parking interfaces with climate action is complex. There's good reason to want to reduce single occupant vehicles across the board, even in the absence of climate. But if we're focused on climate, we should make sure that the actions we're taking on parking have the maximum impact on emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Next up, Bob, followed by Mirabai.
Thanks, Mary. Well, I'm going to agree with Aaron and Sam. I think this is a great first step, and I don't have a lot of pushback on anything that's been recommended. So if I don't say anything, assume that I support what staff is recommending. The one area I'm a little bit concerned about is the increase in the parking rate in the garages downtown for two reasons. One, right now our downtown parking garages are free on Saturdays and Sundays. We have so reason number one, we have a perception, and I think it is just a perception. We have a perception by some members of our community that it's difficult to park downtown, and so some people don't come downtown, and some people don't have access to transit or bikes. And so driving to downtown, whether they're coming from a transit desert or they're coming from another city, is their only option. And the one thing that I know the downtown has been successful about is touting the fact that, well, on weekends it's free. You can come on Saturday, you can come on Sunday, you can go to the farmer's market, you can go shopping, stroll the mall. And, $3 may not seem like a lot of money, but it's just one more barrier. It's one more reason why people can say, geez, I'm not coming downtown. And I think it's an attribute that we have, and I'd hate to lose it. Second, if I understood you correct, it sounds like that $3 parking is going to also apply on Sundays, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me since the on-street parking is free on Sundays. So it seems like we got that upside down if that's the case. If it's only $3 on Saturday, I'll withdraw that comment. But if we're charging $3 on either Saturday or Sunday, we're now charging more in the parking garage than when we'd be on street, which I think is exactly opposite of what you're trying to achieve. And then third, I guess I had 3 points. I want to echo concerns that Rachel raised. Oftentimes, the workers we have working downtown on the weekends are the lowest wage workers. They're the dishwashers, the people waiting tables, the people at the cash registers. They're not the office workers or the people that are making minimum wage or thereabouts. And $3 may not seem like a lot, but if it's $3 on a Friday night because they have to go home, and $3 again on a Saturday night, and $3 again on a Sunday night, and suddenly that's upwards of an hour's worth of their wage that weekend. And so I appreciate the fact you're going to be doing some more outreach to low-income folks and trying to find some subsidy programs. But for all three reasons, I would really encourage us to stick with our free parking on the weekends in the garages. That's all I have.
Thank you, Bob. Mirabai.
I just wanted to give a quick response and say I appreciate everything. I don't have much pushback on anything as well. A little bit of what Bob was saying with the parking garages, making sure that people can get down to town. There's lots of people who cannot take other forms of transportation. And so I just wouldn't want shops, small businesses to get harmed by that. A little bit concerned about some of the neighborhoods for residents who live there. But I'm willing to kind of watch and see how it goes and hear from the community as we continue on with the next steps. So pretty mild feedback. I think you guys are doing a wonderful job and I'm excited to see how this progresses. So well done from my side.
Thank you, Mirabai. Aaron, is that an old hand or a new hand? Oh.
Old hand.
Rachel?
Thanks. I'm going to echo most of what's already been said. I'm largely in support of the staff memo. I like Aaron's suggestion to look into raising the rates and using the additional funds for kind of transportation related purposes. To Sam's point in getting data on residential kind of travel patterns and whether they will have an impact on climate. I agree we need to do that. And I would, again, welcome consulting with EAB or our staff experts. It feels like it's not yet like a holistic look at this because we are all concerned with the climate impacts. And well, again, while I appreciate transportation department really lifting them up, or TAB, I do think that it should be from our resident experts on climate and environmental issues. So I'd love to see that in a next step. And then I also like Sam's idea of a regional approach, kind of like we were looking at with minimum wage. We were going to look at raising that regionally so that we could stay regionally competitive and not kind of drive people to neighboring cities. So I don't know how we would get at that with some of our rates, but I think that's a great idea. And then again, kind of like Sam was getting at with private parking, if our goals are in part to get people to move away from driving, both for climate and Vision Zero kind of purposes, seems like we should also be looking more at residential neighborhoods like mine, where there's just lots of street parking. And so we do get the benefit of the street parking just without the crowding. And so we don't need neighborhood parking permits. So I don't know what other cities are doing, if anything, on that front, but I would be curious if other places are sort of converting more residential street parking to something that offers a better community benefit. So I guess I would just be curious to hear if that's happening and what the options might be. And otherwise, we'll, again, just lift up. I think it is important as part of our overall strategies that we look very seriously at using this opportunity to promote our climate crisis response goals. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Junie.
Thank you, Mary. That was really a great memo, great presentation, very thorough. I agree with the residential parking program plan. I am not sold on the increased parking fine because I'm not sold on the full benefit of it. I don't know where's the evidence and data even though you mentioned there are a few cities around the country that have implemented the graduated fine, but I'm just not sure if that can really impact behavior. And you mentioned it's a small group that is often repeat offenders. So I'm thinking, well, does a small group really should be, or what's the word, almost like the anchor as to why we change or fine the amount of fine that we charge. I do agree with this idea of that was mentioned earlier about reaching out to HRC to get a sense. I mean, I know that's a lot of work because we are talking in commuters. That's a lot of people and people who are not living in the community, but they also impact us, as was mentioned earlier, when we talk about climate change and climate resiliency. But I think they play a huge role because I live near downtown and I can just walk just about anywhere, but these people can't. And so they really, they impact our behavior in our work. So finding a way of reaching some, if not all, but I get a sense that maybe the chamber and the small businesses somehow, you know, are somewhat a substitute, but nonetheless, knowing the impact, it would be very informative and helpful because again, they are the one commuting in. I agree wholeheartedly with Bob. And there's something, as you were having this discussion tonight, when I heard all the different processes, the different type of engagement and programs, I was thinking to myself, I've walked around Boulder for the last 3 years. I do believe this is a very friendly community. It's inviting, it's beautiful. And the more I hear about the different programming, I'm thinking, my gosh, this is sounding very unfriendly. And the reason why I said that is because I have visited New York City and their parking system. It's a beautiful city. It's a very, very inspiring city. Anyone who, well, I remember the first time I went to New York, it was so overwhelming that I cried. And I cried because of how beautiful it was. But parking in New York is horrible. It's almost like, I went to law school. It's almost like you have to read it in a way, you park at this time. And just hearing you tonight, I thought to myself, you know, some of the parking processes are sounding unfriendly to people who are just coming to visit Boulder. And I hope that's not what end up happening in the end. That is not the result, even though we intend something good and hopefully we don't keep people away. And as Bob mentioned, the people who come to Boulder to work on the weekends are blue collars or working class people, and providing them access to parking goes along with our equity. And another thing that I wanted to say as well with what I heard earlier with increasing the in-commuter, you know, the in-commuter pass to close to 1,000 or more because of our climate goals. But I think it's so important as a community, as we think about these things, that we think about, again, we care about equity. What does that really mean if we increase it to $1,000? Who are those people who are commuting into Boulder every day? And I think taking into account of who these people are and what they do will really help inform how much it should be. And I think, again, part of that discussion, having HRC might actually help us in figuring that out. Again, thank you for the presentation. I think it was really, really great presentation, very thoughtful, make us think about the hard questions, but I think some things definitely we need to think along the line of equity and the impact of the working class people who are coming into Boulder, and we need them. That's another thing too, is that these people are needed. You know, how do we make life easier for them as well, as we're contemplating how to make the environment better? So it's multi-pronged. It's not one thing. It's not it's not curbing people's behavior in that sense where we somehow penalize them from coming into Boulder. Thank you.
Thank you, Junie. Mark?
Yeah, first, I'd like to say she has nailed New York parking in her description of it. It's the home of breathtakingly high fines and close combat if you actually want to get a parking spot. My comments are very, very brief. I think it was an excellent presentation, very comprehensive. I share Bob's concern about the impact on workers of increased parking. I'd ask you to look at that a little bit. And I also liked Aaron's suggestion that maybe we go a little bit past cost recovery in our parking programs and see if there's a little bit of revenue that can be raised. I would do it modestly, but I think it's certainly a concept worth taking a harder look at. But other than that, I'm very supportive of what you've done. It obviously is reflective of a lot of work, and you should be very pleased with the product that you've produced. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Any other comments? I will weigh in then. I agree with Aaron on kind of tweaking the neighborhood parking permit program so that each type of permit has its own pricing, especially with the visitor parking. I know of folks that hand over those visitor parkings to people who actually work downtown. So you might want to, kind of reconsider that one a little bit. I agree with Sam that whatever extra money is brought in past cost recovery needs to be used for TDM, and that if we're going to use NPP as a climate response, we need to quantify it. And I don't think that was within the scope of this particular project. The performance-based pricing is good, agree with that. The fines that are stepped up for blocking buses and bikes, I think that's a good recommendation as well. Talking to more in-commuters, especially middle and lower income. I really like the idea of taking a regional approach and then trying to find the levers that we can move from there. But again, I don't believe that that was part of the scope of this particular project. And I agree with Bob with respect to the parking garages on weekends for all the reasons that he stated. As far as the graduated fines for repeat offenders, I'm going to have to disagree with Junie, because I think that is a strategy that people use. As staff conveyed to us in the presentation, that people will take their chances because $15 is so low that, hey, they can pay lots of $15 tickets. And as we learned in the policing presentation with the Pareto Principle, it's probably 20% of the people that get 80% of the tickets. So if it does change behavior, maybe we'll, we may get those repeat offenders to quit repeat offending. So that's really all I have. I really appreciate the outreach that you did to the mobile businesses, and I really appreciated the responses to my question about the systems and scaling of parking policies. Again, I don't think that was part of the scope of this particular project, but thank you very much. I think that you are on the right path. That's all I have. Council, any other comments? All right.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Council. I would say I feel like there's a little bit of ambiguity moving forward on the garage pricing on weekends and the graduated fines as far as any not of of council on whether or not we should continue to include those. As I was just going through my counts, and I'm not sure if we want to try provide clarity now or consider that later on in the process.
I think that we could do that right now. If we can do just, you know, a quick poll and see how people are feeling about. Let's start with the graduated fines. Who would like? Go ahead. Who would like to change them? I guess.
You mean to have graduated fines? Yes.
To have the graduated fines.
It looks like everyone but Juni's. Okay.
Okay, and the parking garages, maintaining the free on weekends for parking garages. Who is supportive?
Can I make a comment, Mary?
Yes, please, Aaron.
Just that I'm open to considering starting to charge on the weekends. Bob's point about the Sunday being free on street, I thought was a good one. So I don't know that if maybe the place to start would be Saturday if we did start charging for weekend parking. But I would want some, if we did, it sounds like a majority doesn't want to consider. If we did consider, I would want additional downtown business outreach before we did.
And I think that the point that Bob made about the free on Sundays was sort of defeating the whole purpose behind having the parking garage price go up. So a little more analysis, I guess, is what I would support on to Aaron's point before deciding that both days would be free, would be my my suggestion. So to poll again, is there support for doing a little more analysis on the Sunday piece of it and holding on to the Saturday?
I count 1, 2, 3, 4. Adam, we need your vote. No hand from Adam. So I think it is evenly split, Mary. I think
okay.
It looked like more.
Ambiguous, Chris.
There's ambiguity, Chris. We do not, it doesn't sound like there's a clear message from council on weekends. So you'll have to go think about that.
Yeah, we can bring back some options and do some more outreach.
That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the great input.
Okay. Good night, Chris and Chris.
Thank you.
Good night.
And thank you, Mallory.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. All right, on to the next item.
Thank you, Mary. And I apologize that my video is off. I've been popping in and out because I have some video malfunction, but just appreciate the thoughtful discussion and really the feedback of incorporating particularly climate and equity concerns into the previous conversation. And personally appreciated hearing more of Junie's personal driving habits. So thank you, Junie. Our last and final presentation, you have asked us to talk a little bit more about the capital infrastructure tax renewal. And to do that, we have Cheryl Patelli and Joe Wagner in finance to talk a little bit more about that work, what that went into that.
Thanks, Nuria, and thank you, Taylor, for running the presentation for us. Next slide. So the main purpose of tonight's presentation is really to review the city's unfunded needs and provide rationale around which projects were chosen for the community survey. Also, Joel is here to provide a brief update on community outreach in the survey. Next slide. So we've seen this slide several times before. Just wanted to remind everyone of our capital infrastructure funding strategies for the last decade. It started with the capital improvement bond in 2011. We then asked voters and they graciously approved a 3-year 0.3% sales tax for community culture and safety. That was followed by a renewal of that tax for 4 additional years, and a portion of both of those were given to community nonprofits. And then also in 2018, the city dedicated some of its operating revenue from the general fund to develop a government capital fund. So we put around 5 to 7 million a year into that fund. Next slide. So direction, we just wanted to remind council regarding direction from the February 9th study session. And this direction was given to both the Financial Strategy Committee and staff. And the first was there was to be no community committee like we had with CCS. And really a big reason behind that related to COVID. Back in 2020 and early 21, priorities were really shifted due to the pandemic. So time, it really shortened the time frame for work on this project. Also, the FSC to collaborate with outside experts in developing a statistical valid community survey. Also recommend a tax structure, so term and designated uses based on the community outreach results, which mainly is the community survey. And then recommend initial project or categories for the ballot language. And as a reminder, at the July 20th study session, FSC will be providing recommendations to the full council on term, community split, projects, and debt amounts related to the ballot measure to be considered for discussions in August regarding the language. Next slide. So here's a look at all of the city's unfunded infrastructure needs. And really here we're talking about general fund departments without a dedicated funding source. So departments such as OS&P and utilities do have dedicated funding, and they're not included in this list. And back in February and also in your memo, you will notice that the amount was slightly lower than what we're presenting this evening. There were two climate projects that we also included in this list. So we're looking at 312 million through a variety of projects, most of which we are hoping to fund in the next 7 years. So over 220 million of that. And all of the projects identified in this list are either essential or important per our budgeting for resilience definitions. So again, to remind you, essential is for basic city functioning, critical to life and safety, important, valued by the community with clear legislative support. Also, if we look at our current or pending master plans, 93% of these projects fall into fiscally constrained or action plans. So these are really to support basic city services, not really rising to the level of the visionary plans in those master plans. Next slide. So this slide shows, it's a little busy, but these $314 million of unfunded projects, both by category and department. And I will define these project categories in the upcoming slides. These are the same categories that we used in the community survey. As you can see, the Safe and Prepared Boulder accounts for over half of these unfunded projects, followed by Active and Healthy and Transportation. And the departments similarly line up, Fire and Rescue, 45%, and then Facilities, Facilities, Transportation, Police, and Parks and Rec all equate for 11 to 12% of these projects. Next slide. So the purpose of this evening, I'm not going to go through every single and explain every single project. There is summary information in your packet, but if you have questions about specific projects, please be sure to ask them. We do have staff here this evening who will be able to answer your questions. Just to note on these pages, the next several slides, the bolded projects represent projects that were designated as projects that may be funded on the community survey, and more to come about these projects. But I will define each of these areas as we defined in the community survey. So for Safe and Prepared Boulder, emergency response is a critical component of Boulder's ability to be resilient in the face of increasing environmental and other challenges that can affect safety and well-being of Boulder residents and visitors. Boulder has fallen behind in maintaining and replacing the capital infrastructure that supports its first responders. And clearly, as you can see, we have a lot of aging fire stations that need to be replaced. In addition, if we are looking at doing advanced life support, these will have to be replaced. We don't have the current infrastructure for those that program. Also in this list, you'll notice the public safety building expansion for approximately 30 million, along with some other smaller police department projects. Next slide. So transportation system resilience, maintaining and modernizing Boulder's transportation system to allow for safer and more efficient flow for all modes of transportation, pedestrian, bikes, vehicles. Better traffic flow ultimately leads to lower GHG emissions. And what we put on the survey is certainly the largest item here, transportation maintenance. Also included in unfunded projects are hot bus electrification, as well as transit partnerships and some other projects. Next slide. Active and healthy Boulder, the capital stack needed to provide residents the amenities and opportunities to recreate and maintain healthy and active lifestyles. Physical health and well-being are critical to the resilience of Boulder residents. Here included, we had the rec center renovations, and I will note we do have a special climate category, but these certainly include retrofitting to our climate standards. A Boulder Creek corridor, various parks throughout the city, along with athletic fields and cultural preservation. Next slide. Customer service modernization. Providing high quality customer service in a timely manner relies on information flow from the city to the customer and residents and vice versa. Modernizing and consolidating the city's data infrastructure and outreach tool will allow for better customer service for all needs. We talked last month about the constituent relationship management, or CRM, as well as the enterprise data warehouse. Also included on these lists are some large systems throughout the city, replacements of those systems, as well as some smaller IT projects. Next slide. Progress toward climate goals. Boulder's ambitious climate goals require a broad effort as it relates to city capital. At a minimum, Boulder's aged facilities need to be renovated and retrofitted to reduce carbon footprint. So these are the projects that were added from the February meeting, and they include utilities, undergrounding, streetlight acquisition. And again, just to note, many other projects that I've talked about include or contribute to climate goals. Certainly the fire stations, if built, would also be up to our code, as well as many of these other projects. Next slide. This is our final category, other, which is basically anything that didn't fall into the previous categories. We have things such as alpine balsam. The largest one here, of course, is our maintenance backlog of our buildings. It's pretty sizable, as you can see, as well as the Boulder Civic Area Phase 2 development plan. Next slide. So those are the projects that total well over $300 million. And based on the direction that we were given in February 9th, staff and the FSC Financial Strategy Committee set out to narrow down the list to a small number of projects in some project categories that can be included in the community survey. And the full unfunded need list was informed by master plans, facility assessment, and other tools that we have here at the city. Again, the intent here was not to choose the final projects, just the projects that will be listed in the survey as those that may be funded. So from the greater list of 47 projects, departments presented a subset of 15 high priority near-term projects to the Financial Strategy Committee. These were carefully selected to maximize impact, so we wanted to make sure it had a broad benefit and solve pressing capital needs. They also could start in the next few years. And then the final projects selected for the survey did include criteria, or were selected based on the criteria that both the Financial Strategy Committee and staff worked on before we even started this entire exercise. So that criteria is in your memo. It's pretty extensive and I think important to the overall selection here. Next slide. Here again are just all of those bolded projects that were included in the survey listed on one page for you. So what you'll notice when I get to the next slide is our total is 88 million, which is less than what we're looking at receiving for the tax itself. Next slide. So we did the community survey really to gauge community support for a tax extension ballot item. Some of the things asked: potential uses, what I've talked about this entire presentation, specific city projects and project categories, term and length of tax. So we did ask questions about a 10-year term and a 15-year term. Portion of tax proceeds that would be dedicated to community nonprofits through a grant program. We asked questions on a 10%, 15, and 20%. And then related debt authorization questions for both a 10-year debt issuance and a 15-year debt issuance. And as a reminder, these revenue estimates were based on CU's May modeling. So certainly we do expect that they will change throughout time, but this is the best information that we have as of right now. And then for my final remarks, I did want to provide a little bit of exciting news regarding the survey itself. We currently have 828 completed interviews. We sent out a reminder today, a text reminder, and we will send another one out on Friday and start the live dialing early next week. I do encourage the public to take this online survey. You can find it on the homepage at Boulder's website. Bob?
No, I just had some questions when you're done.
Okay, we have one more slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Joel, who will talk about the community nonprofit outreach.
Thanks, Cheryl. Good evening, Council. Joel Wagner, Tax and Special Projects Manager. So in addition to the community survey, we're also having some conversations with the local nonprofit community. Because this proposed structure for the community nonprofit component is a departure from the prior two CCS ballot measures, we wanted to ensure that we're on the right track. So we're starting this outreach to community groups. We're organizing focus groups in the next 3 to 4 weeks, and we're targeting 2 groups of nonprofits in 2 separate categories of focus groups. The first would be nonprofits that received matching grants in the first and second ballot items, and the second would be the broader nonprofit community, either organizations that came forward in the first 2 rounds and did not end up on the ballot, or organizations that we haven't spoken to yet that might have capital projects that they're thinking about. So we'll be hosting several meetings with opportunities to attend both during the workday and in the evening. And really the goal of these meetings is to share the current council vision for the nonprofit component and to gather feedback from these organizations on how to present this concept to voters, what feedback they might give us for administration of the program if it's approved. And we're also hoping to form connections and understand what the nonprofit community's needs are, as well as gauge interest in and support for the ballot item with this concept. And we can go to the next slide. The questions.
All right, then. Thank you very much, Joel and Cheryl. Bob, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to staff for this update. This is very helpful for catching several of us up on the process and more information about some of these prospective projects that could go in the ballot. I have a couple questions about specific projects, and I have a few questions that are more general. I think my first question really is probably addressed to Chief Calderazzo, and it relates to the fire station. If we go back to slide number 7 on the public health or public safety one, that would be helpful. I'll start asking my question as that's coming up. So among the $88 million that's being projects that are being pulled, 2 of them are for fire stations. One is $11 million for completion of fire station number 3, and another $35 million is for a new fire station, either a new one for number 2 or number 4. So that's $46 million, which is a little bit more than half of the $88 million. So that obviously kind of swamps things a bit. Chief, is it possible that a fire station replacement can be done for less than 35 million? And if so, what would we be giving up for that if we did a station for 25 or $30 million, just to pick numbers out of the air?
First of all, good evening, Council. No, it's a late evening. Again, for the record, I guess my name's up there, but Mike Calderazzo, Fire Chief. And I appreciate the question. I know these take a huge chunk out. A lot of it is the expected land cost and the construction costs that have escalated over the last few years. We've learned a pretty tough lesson with Fire Station 3. The short answer to your question is I don't know exactly whether or not we can trim. If we're asking whether we can trim the size of the stations, that's a different conversation. Most of the expense actually is in the support services areas of the stations, which is why all of our stations are so undersized and in need of either rebuilding or renewal of some form or fashion. So I'd hesitate to be able to give you a good answer there. Part of this is so that we can be opportunistic going forward. So to jump on potentially a good deal, so to speak, would be something we'd want to be able to do to minimize the overall cost. So we'd like to be able to do these for lesser cost. I can't guarantee it, and I can't even guarantee the time frame, depending on when either land becomes available or we can strike a deal, or it's public-private partnership or public-public partnership. But in terms of the size of the stations, we've sized them actually where we think they need to be to support advanced life support at the present time and for the life of the master plan, and hopefully for the next 50 years. So that's what's in there right now, and it's entirely based on land and construction costs.
Thanks, Chief. Maybe we can go for, I have a couple other specific questions. I think the rest of these are for Allie Rhodes. Go forward to slide number 9, which is 2 more on active and healthy lifestyles. Allie, could you elaborate a little bit more on both those that are bolded? The Boulder Creek Corridor, could you talk a little bit more about what that is, what we would get for that $7 million?
I can do that, but Parks Planning Manager and Ecological Services Manager Jeff Haley is here, and I think he can do it better.
Great.
We'll see if I can do it better. Thanks for the question, Bob. Yeah, the Boulder Creek Corridor, we're actually just getting ready to do a pretty comprehensive study and management plan for the Creek Corridor, basically stretching from Ebengee Fine towards the west end of town, perhaps all the way out to 55th Street. What this would do, we anticipate having implementation priorities from that plan that would outline new visitor areas, recreation areas along the creek, specific access points to the creek, ecological restoration throughout the corridor. So if you think about a lot of the trees we've had to remove due to emerald ash borer along the stream and some of the other water quality issues, we're hoping this project will address a lot of that. And if you also think about Ebengee Fine, the stream bank stabilization we did several years ago there along the park, where there's designated ecological restoration areas, then there's very designated recreation. It's that type of approach where we'd like to restore the creek back to a very usable, open, visible corridor to increase safety, usability, and that sort of thing.
Thanks, Jeff. That's real helpful. And then my final specific question, I have a couple of general ones, is on slide 12, which is the miscellaneous category. I think these are for you, or for you, Ali. Could you talk a little bit more about what the community would get on the third and fourth ones, the Pearl Street Mall refresh? What would $4 million do for that? And then on the civic area phase 2 development, the $8 million, what would we get for that?
Sure. So on the Pearl Street Mall, it would be generally, you know, Bob, we've talked with Community Vitality and Downtown Boulder, and there are not specific plans, but we know there are needs for updates, and especially as we approach the 50th anniversary of the mall. And so certainly this project would include updates to the Visitors Information Center and the restrooms, which are dated and regularly encounter issues. It could include enhancements to other amenities that would enhance both accessibility, safety, and just general welcomingness in the downtown corridor, potentially event area in the 13th Street. But for details of it, we would want to work with our downtown business partners and the community to say exactly what those refresh would be. For the civic area, I'll remind council that we have an incredible civic area master plan, that the first phase was the park at the core that Jeff just talked about, the enhancements we made between the civic area and the library and between Arapahoe and Canyon. Still yet to be completed other elements of that plan, and specifically enhancements on the east bookend that would really help achieve a lot of community goals. And so specifically that phase 2, again, I might call on Jeff for the specific elements of that project if I did not cover it.
Yeah, just to tag onto that, thanks, Ali. In terms of the civic park, it's really that area, Central Park and the East Bookend, which is primarily 13th Street over to Broadway, and then from Canyon to Arapahoe. What the plan showed for that area was better activation, better functionality of that Central Park space. As you know, recently transportation improved the underpass there to Arapahoe. And so what this would do is actually up in the park area, provide more flexible multi-use areas to support events like the farmers market. We've been doing a ton of activation at the band shell now to really use that space and provide opportunities for the community. It would enhance that area. There's a multi-use path connection that would lead folks up to the intersection of Broadway and Canyon and 13th. To create a better connection with the Pearl Street Mall down to the civic area. So it's that general functionality, access to and through the site, and just better using the space for all the great activation and events that have really kicked off more since we've done that phase 1 project west of Broadway. I would just recommend, this does not get into a lot of the vertical construction and infrastructure that you'd seen some of those concepts years ago. This is still more within the park and adjacent roadway.
Great, that was really helpful, both Ali and Jeff. Then just have some general questions that are probably more for Cheryl. Cheryl, as we've learned more about ARPA and the money that we're getting from the federal government, I assume that we're going to apply that filter to our final list of projects here as we develop them in late July, early August, so that if there is a project that we're really keen on, but we're allowed to use ARPA funds for that project, it probably wouldn't make sense to also put it on the ballot and free up that money for things that would not qualify for ARPA. And similarly, I assume that you're, for example, in the transportation projects, you're applying kind of a Dr. Cog filter. So if there was money that could be obtained from Dr. Cog or from other, I know there's lots of transportation money available. We can't count on the federal infrastructure bill quite yet, but I know that we get sometimes support on the state level for those things. So I assume that those filters either have been applied or will be applied as we know more about availability. Is that right?
Correct. Staff is working on that, and we hope to present that with our July 20th presentation.
That's great. That's great. And the last thing I'll just suggest, I guess, as you guys prepare for that July 20th presentation, I know this is tough. I'm just going to throw it out there. To the extent that any of these projects have a return on investment, some of them are just things we got to do. I mean, we got to patch the roads. We don't get any money back for that. I get that. But some of these projects, as I go through and look at them, some of the recreation projects, some of the Pearl Street projects, some of the other projects probably have a bit of a return on investment. That is, if we improve the infrastructure, more people will participate, whether it's at the rec center or on Pearl Street or whatever. To the extent you guys can do a little bit of a back of the envelope on some of these projects and the return on investment. I know it's a swag, but a little bit of information at that July 20th session on return on investment for those that do or might would be kind of helpful as we make our decisions.
We'll go back to the departments and see what information they can provide. I'm sure a lot of that has probably been done for these many of these projects.
Yeah, that's great. That's all I had. Thanks for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Sam.
Thank you, Mary. I want to start out with a big thank you to staff and to the Financial Strategy Committee for having done a huge amount of work winnowing these projects down. So as Mary reminded us, it was many hours of their life hearing about the possible projects and presenting them to us. So thank you all for that. I really have questions pretty much around where Bob did on the first few. So Chief Calderazzo, I wanted to speak about advanced life support. And I believe, if I recall correctly, when we had this conversation several months ago, there were a few flavors of advanced life support. One is where all of our responding firefighters are trained as paramedics, and another was where we do transport. And so I understood that getting everyone trained up and equipped as paramedics was one level of effort, and then certainly adding ambulances and doing transport would require a lot more, both equipment and infrastructure. So is the estimate that we have here $2.5 to $4.5 million, is that just for creating paramedics for all firefighters, paramedic skills for all firefighters, or does that also include ambulances and other equipment?
I'm sorry, Sam, which number are we referring to? I don't think I tracked.
I'm sorry, I'm on slide 7.
Slide 7.
We've got advanced life support capital infrastructure, $3.5 million. And then somewhere in the memo, I believe it said it includes training and equipment as well as capital.
Yes, that did include the rolling stock and potentially adding those units to the system.
So what if we were to do it in 2 phases? One where we're not doing transport, but all our responding firefighters are trained as paramedics. Do you know what that would cost?
So that is built into the system. So the way we have it set up in the master plan, it actually is to roll out where we would begin with just the firefighters and increasing their skill level to paramedic on existing apparatus. So that would not only require the training and whatever the additional expense is associated with that, as well as retrofitting vehicles if we needed to put, and the stations as well, to put medications, temperature control, locking mechanisms, so on. So that's already built into the progression over the next 10 years. So the idea is start at the core, and it would be the core areas of the city where we receive most of our calls now, where all the demand is. So 2s, 3s, and 4s, which are right around the central portions of town. From there, we could branch out and we could take over ambulances, and that would engender the additional 3 or 4 million that we've got built into the capital infrastructure. Or council may decide that's not what we want to do. We prefer the contractual approach where you provide the advanced life support or the paramedic capabilities, but patient transport will be handled by a third party or so on. So it's built in that way where we have options. We have points where we can even off ramp and do a different system that still has us at the core providing the advanced life support and bringing those response times down, which is what the ultimate goal is. So it is built into the system. That is a cost that could be, we may decide we don't want to spend the money, the 4 million on the ambulances and all of that. The expenses associated with the structures, though, those need to be done pretty much regardless of how ALS unfolds over time. We need to make those changes.
So sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure I'm clear on your answer. We will be moving towards paramedic training for all of our firefighters under the current budget and the current plan without this component of the capital infrastructure.
We can, yes, we can do that without the capital piece of it. We can additionally train people. However, we'll never realize the full build out, even with everyone going ALS, if we don't build in the support structures in our stations, hence the need to do station 2 and 4. We can begin the training. We can start, we've already begun. In fact, some of our budget requests for next year will in fact engender some of those ideas in them. So that's all operating, of course. So it would be a different source.
Right, but there's the medication and the storage, there's capital involved. It's just not huge dollar amounts. Okay, so again, we are moving forward with that. We'll see that in the 2022 budget proposal. We can talk about that operational piece in the budget proposal. What is here in the community culture and safety tax proposal, and it did not get included, that $3.5 million is for ambulances, is for going all the way with ALS. So if we do not put that in and do not include it, it's not going to stop us from increasing our capability for ALS. It's just not going all the way.
True. Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's super helpful. And I guess I would repeat Bob's question. It certainly does seem like if you could shave 10 to 15% off of the station 2 or 4 replacement, you could fund everything for going all the way with ALS. So I just wanted to make sure I understood where you're planning right now. That's super helpful. Thank you. And then the other question I've got back to you, Allie and Jeff, is about the same things that Bob asked about, which are the Boulder Creek corridor and the East Boulder Rec Center retrofit and renovation. Would it be possible to do those in phases? Like Boulder Creek corridor, you got 7 million. Is that something we could decide that we wanted to fund at 4 million and get, half of the benefits of? Similarly with the East Boulder Rec Center, is it possible to phase that, or is that like need to all be done at once?
Yeah. I'll take that and let Jeff add if I miss something. So with the Creek corridor, absolutely. And you've seen how we've done that with the improvements at M&G Fine Park and in the civic area. A recreation center is much harder to phase out. It would have a bigger impact on the community because of taking a facility out of commission. It also would have cost escalation. When you mobilize for vertical construction in a project, there's real efficiencies in that. And so the more you can do all at once, the more effective it is in costing and the less impact there is for the community. So I do think for a facility, if you're going to do major renovations, the more you can do all at once, the better it is for everyone.
Okay, great. I think that answers all of my questions. I guess I have a similar one about the mall. If we end up back at that conversation, would be phasing it or doing partial work on that. And I guess what I'll put out there for council to think about is both from a public relations standpoint and from a kind of mission of the city standpoint, it certainly seems to me like we want to be thinking about the advanced life support piece here, because it is a fraction of what the facility costs are, 3 million as opposed to 30 million. And because the Creek corridor could be phased, one of the things I want us to think about as we finalize it is what we want to do to include advanced life support. So that's why I asked those questions, because it seems to me that that is a critical life safety issue. And I just wanted us to have that in our thought process as we go forward. That's all my questions, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Junie?
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for the presentation. And I have several questions and I'm trying to think, where do I want to start? But I just wanted some clarification about, I think I heard a comment about the ARPA funding. And I just wanted to make sure that, am I correct to think there's no correlation between the ARPA funding and the community resilience and safety tax renewal programming?
You are correct. What we're doing as it relates to both is looking through our project list that we presented tonight and seeing what, if any, projects would may be eligible for ARPA funding and then bringing that information back to you. But there is no relationship between the two.
Okay, thank you. And I think the comment I wanted to add as well, because I was looking at, just looking at our slides, it says there are 47 projects that are unfunded for $312 million, and that 20 to 22 million dollars that we're getting from the ARPA funding, it's barely a drop in the bucket for that type of programming. And my thought, or at least my understanding from different conferences that I've attended and working groups, I'm wondering if the city is doing any type of community engagement around that money to find out how to best use it. Because I understand your proposal, or where that's heading, where you're looking at programming and how that money could be used. But I'm wondering, this is taxpayer money, and again, we have a community here that is suffering. Some people in the community are suffering, and how do we best serve them as opposed to putting this money toward programming? So my question is the city doing any type of community engagement to find out how to best spend that money on behalf of the community?
So the answer is yes. And I just want to clarify, at this point, staff is not recommending that we utilize any or part of that money for these projects. It's just something that we're reviewing to put out on the table. So we do have a group of folks who are working to develop the plan for our ARPA funding. And really we're thinking initially trying to find the most critical needs. And then for the remainder of the money, making sure that we have a strategic approach, which most certainly would involve outreach to different organizations and folks throughout the community.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just remember as well, as part of this conversation, staff did send us an email based on from an email on how to spend the money from, I believe, from one of our boards. The name of the board just escaped me, but they had a lot of great idea on how to reach community through this funding. Yes, and I think my next question to you is, it's slide, well, I can't tell the slide number, but it's about the library deferred capital maintenance, the $3.3 million. And since we've just recently had the discussion about the districting, I'm wondering, is this funding necessary? Because if the hope is to district, let's say the next year or the year after, how is this funding? Is it a good use of the funding right now to put it toward the library? Or is that something that is still needed no matter what, even if we district?
So I'm gonna ask Devin or someone to provide more information about this, because I'm not aware of the specifics and the timing.
Yes, thank you for that, Cheryl. Junie, yes, to answer your question, that particular project did not make it onto the survey for that exact reason. So the thinking was that it is a current need, but there is an alternative funding mechanism that we could use if districting were to occur in the next 2 years or so, and if in fact that districting were not to occur, then this project could certainly return. As Cheryl had mentioned, the survey does only include 88 million, which is not the total amount that the tax could generate. So perhaps maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, this particular project could get funding through the capital tax, but we did not think that it was appropriate to be included in this process at this time.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you, Cheryl.
Aaron.
Yeah, thanks for all this information. Really appreciate that. Just to clarify in terms of next steps, right? So this is a list of potential projects that we've identified needs for, right? And we have put a few of them on the survey to judge community interest. But when it comes time to put this on the ballot, assuming that we do, we'll pick a few projects that we commit to, right, as part if the ballot measure passes, and then give a list of other types of projects like X, Y, and Z, but more general. And then from that point on, we would have a process to determine where the funding would go. But we're not, other than the projects that actually make it onto the ballot, we're not committing to any of these, right? This is just all potential things that we could fund.
Yes, correct.
Great. So then our decision this year is really about picking the top, however many it is, 4, 8, or 10 that we put in the ballot measure, and the rest of it is really a decision for, future councils with the future process.
Yeah, yes, that's correct, Aaron. Along with some of the other, like the term and the debt, those are what we will be coming to for.
Got it. So that's helpful that in terms of what we have to decide in the next 2 or 3 months is not about this entire list or ranking all of them, but just really about those top 2 projects that we put on the measure. Thanks. That's all I had.
Thank you, Aaron. Any other questions from council? Oh, yes, Bob.
Yeah, just Aaron made me think of something that I want to just throw out there as a scheduling suggestion. So I think we haven't had any public hearings on this. We've had a few study sessions. We're going to have another study session on July 20th. And then we're scheduled to do first reading on the ballot measure on August 3rd, which of course is not a public hearing. Well, it's not yet a public hearing. And then the first and only public hearing we'll have on this will be a second reading on August 17, which also happens to be our last clear date to put something on the ballot. And what I'm a little bit concerned about is that because we haven't, I know we're going to do a survey, but we haven't had public hearings on this. The very first public hearing we'd have, and the first time we would hear from community members who choose to come out and speak to us about what they think should be the the headliners that Aaron was just referring to, is when we're already a second reading, and it'll be too late for us to make changes. I guess we could pass out an emergency that night. And I'm just wondering if CAC might think about flipping the order of the public hearing and actually doing a first reading public hearing on August 3rd. So we have the benefit of hearing from the community and can make some adjustments at first reading rather than scrambling at first reading, which is our last clear date to put this on the ballot. I don't know what the night looks like on the 3rd. I think it's National Night Out, so we may not have a ton of time on that night, but it just might be nice to have on our public hearing not be the last day that we make a decision on what the headliners are for the ballot. Just throwing that out there.
So I can respond to that, Bob. One thing that we had considered, and I brought it up at CAC yesterday, was having first and second reading or public hearing for first reading on August 3rd. So that would be a way to kind of address the issue of timing, is to have a public hearing on both items that are related to the tax and bond measures, and then also on any initiative petitions.
I would support that if that's the will of council and that's what CAC wants to do. Thanks, Sandra.
Yeah, and Bob, I'll just jump in here and say, I think there is room potentially to do that on the 3rd. We would have to shuffle a few things around, but I think there's one item that's not time sensitive that we could move. And per what Sandra just said, I think the other two items that we have now are ballot measures to talk about as well.
Thanks, Sam.
All right, thank you. Sandra, I think you put up your hand, but that's an old hand, I think.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. All right, any other questions from council? All right. Does council want to make any comments, or has everybody made them as we went along? All right, it sounds like this item met our needs and has, and I guess I'll ask council, has this presentation addressed the concerns that were brought up a few weeks ago? All right, great. So I think that's it. And if no one has any other comments, I think that we are done for the evening.
Done for 3 whole weeks.
Yay, happy recess, everybody. See you on July 13th. Enjoy the break. Bye.
Thank you all.
Mary. Bye.
Good night, everyone. Take care.
Everybody.